The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Evelyn Hart tasted blood. She'd bitten her tongue somewhere between the last pothole and whatever rock they'd just slammed over, and the copper tang mixed with the dust coating her mouth made her want to spit. But ladies didn't spit, even ladies who'd spent 3 weeks being rattled across half a continent like dice in a cup. She pressed her handkerchief to her lips and looked out the window at Salvation Creek, Montana Territory. The name had sounded promising in the letters. The reality looked like someone had taken a handful of buildings and thrown them at the base of a mountain just to see if they'd stick. "End of the line, ma'am." The driver's voice came muffled through the roof. "You want help with them bags?" "I can manage." Evelyn straightened her hat, a small miracle it had survived the journey, and gathered her carpet bag. Her trunk would follow. Everything she owned in the world, packed into one trunk and one bag. It should have felt tragic. Instead, it felt like freedom. The step down was higher than she expected. Her boot caught on her skirt and she stumbled, barely catching herself on the coach door. First impression? Perfect. She could practically hear her mother's voice. "Always lead with grace, Evelyn. A woman's reputation is all she has." "Well, Mother, look at me now." The main street stretched before her, rutted and muddy despite the dry weather. False-fronted buildings lined both sides, saloon, general store, what might have been a hotel. A few men loitered outside the saloon, watching her with the blank curiosity of people who had nothing better to do. One of them spat tobacco juice into the street. Evelyn looked away, scanning for anyone who might be Thomas Hendricks. Her intended. Her future. The man whose letters had been so carefully worded, so respectful, so unlike every other man her father had tried to foist on her back in Philadelphia. "Dear Miss Hart," the first letter had begun. "I hope this finds you well. Your advertisement in the Matrimonial Times caught my attention, not for your accomplishments, though they are many, but for your honesty. You wrote that you seek a partnership, not a prison. I find myself in need of the same." She'd written back the same day. Within 3 months, they'd agreed to marry. He'd sent money for the journey, a gentleman's gesture. His letters painted a picture of a man who understood that women had minds as well as pretty faces, who wanted a companion, not a decoration. The stage driver thumped her trunk onto the ground. "You got someone meeting you?" "I'm to meet Mr. Thomas Hendricks at the hotel." She pointed to the building with the faded sign reading Palmer House. The driver's expression changed. Something shuddered behind his eyes. "That's so. Is there a problem?" "No, ma'am. No problem at all." But he wouldn't look at her. You want me to carry that trunk over?" "If you would." He hefted it with a grunt and started across the street. Evelyn followed, trying to avoid the worst of the mud. Her traveling dress was already ruined, but there were degrees of ruination, and she preferred not to arrive looking like she'd crawled. The hotel lobby smelled like old coffee and older tobacco. A clerk stood behind the desk, reading a newspaper with the kind of intense focus people use when they're pretending not to notice something. "Excuse me." Evelyn approached the desk. "I'm looking for Mr. Thomas Hendricks. I believe he's staying here?" The clerk looked up. Young, maybe 20, with a weak chin and nervous eyes. Those eyes darted to the stage driver, then back to Evelyn. "Mr. Hendricks ain't here, ma'am." "When do you expect him back?" "I mean, he ain't staying here, not anymore." The floor felt unsteady. Evelyn gripped her carpet bag tighter. "Do you know where I might find him? It's rather urgent." The clerk opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the driver again. "Just tell her," the driver said quietly. "Ain't no kind way to do it." "Tell me what?" Evelyn's voice came out sharper than she intended. "Ma'am, Mr. Hendricks got married 4 days ago, to Miss Caroline Winters. Well, Mrs. Hendricks now, I suppose." The words landed like punches. Married. 4 days ago. While she'd been rattling across Nebraska, believing she was traveling toward a future, he'd been, "There must be some mistake." Her voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "We had an arrangement. He sent for me." "Yes, ma'am. I heard about that." The clerk had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Thing is, Miss Winters, Mrs. Hendricks, her daddy owns the bank in Helena. When she took an interest in Thomas, well..." He trailed off with an apologetic shrug. "Well, what?" "Well, money talks, ma'am, especially out here." As Evelyn set her carpet bag on the desk very carefully, because if she didn't do something careful and deliberate, she might scream or cry. Or both. Where can I find Mr. Hendricks now? Ma'am, I don't think. Where? Got themselves a house on the north end of town. Big place, yellow paint, can't miss it. She picked up her bag. Thank you. Ma'am, wait. But Evelyn was already walking. Out of the hotel, back into the street, past the men still loitering outside the saloon. Someone whistled. She ignored it. Her boots struck the wooden sidewalk with sharp, angry clicks. A house with yellow paint. How lovely. How cheerful. How perfectly appropriate for a man who'd just destroyed someone's life via absence of basic human decency. She found it easily enough. Yellow as a buttercup, fresh paint gleaming, with a wraparound porch and actual glass windows. The kind of house that screamed money. New money, probably, the kind that bought respectability. Evelyn climbed the porch steps and knocked. A woman answered, blonde, pretty in a delicate way, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Evelyn's entire trunk of possessions. She looked at Evelyn with polite confusion. May I help you? I'm here to see Thomas Hendricks. I'm sorry, do we know you? No, but your husband knows me. Or he should. Understanding dawned slowly, like sunrise through dirty glass. The woman's expression shifted from confusion to comprehension to something that might have been pity. You're her, the mail-order bride. Evelyn flinched at the term, but held her ground. I'm Miss Evelyn Hart. I have a legal arrangement with your husband. An arrangement he no longer needs. A man appeared behind the blonde woman, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of face that looked good in photographs. Thomas Hendricks, presumably. In his letters, he'd sounded kind. In person, he looked like every other man who'd ever looked through Evelyn, like she was made of glass. We had an agreement, Evelyn said. Had being the operative word. Thomas stepped onto the porch, pulling the door partially closed behind him, blocking his wife from view. Miss Hart, I apologize for any inconvenience, but circumstances changed. I sent you funds for a return journey. You sent funds 3 weeks ago, before I left Philadelphia. Then you have money to return. I fail to see the problem. The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. The problem is that I used those funds to settle my debts before leaving, because I believed I had a future here, because you gave me your word. And I'm releasing you from any obligation. You're free to return to your previous life. I have no previous life. The words came out harder than she intended. I gave up my position, my housing. Everything I had was contingent on a life that no longer exists. Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough. That was your choice, Miss Hart. I never asked you to burn your bridges. You asked me to marry you. I made an offer which I have since rescinded. I understand this is disappointing, but you're a resourceful woman. You'll land on your feet. He started to retreat back into his cheerful yellow house. Wait, Evelyn grabbed the porch railing. You owe me more than a dismissal. At least help me find employment. Or accommodations. Something. I owe you nothing. Thomas's voice went cold. You answered an advertisement. I changed my mind. That's my right. Now, if you'll excuse me, my wife and I have dinner plans. The door closed. Locked. Through the window, she could see him return to his blonde bride, could see them exchange words. The wife looked back toward the door with that same pitying expression. Evelyn stood on the porch of a house that should have been partly hers, looking at a life that should have been partly hers, feeling the future she'd imagined crumble into dust. She'd known it was a gamble. Mail-order marriages always were. But she'd read his letters so carefully, had parsed every word for hidden meanings, for signs of cruelty or dishonesty. She'd thought she was being careful. She'd thought she was choosing wisely. She'd been wrong. The walk back to town felt longer, heavier. People stared now. Word traveled fast in small towns, apparently. The abandoned bride. The fool who'd traveled 2,000 miles for a man who'd traded her in for a better offer. At the hotel, the clerk wouldn't meet her eyes. You need a room? Can I afford one? He glanced at the ledger. $1 a night, $2 if you want meals. Evelyn counted her remaining money. After buying supplies for the journey west, after paying the stagecoach fees Thomas's money hadn't covered, she had $11.30. Call it 11 nights if she was careful, less if she ate. One night, she said, just the room. Yes, ma'am. The room was small and spare, bed, chair, washstand, nothing else. But it had a door that locked, and right now that was worth the dollar. Evelyn locked it, dropped her carpet bag, and sat on the bed. The mattress was lumpy. The sheets smelled like lye soap. The window overlooked an alley where someone had thrown trash. She'd left Philadelphia for this. Left her job at the boarding house where she'd worked since her father died. Left the tiny room under the eaves that had been hers. Left the familiar streets and familiar faces for the promise of something better. Partnership, respect, a chance to build instead of just survive. What an idiot she'd been. The knock on the door came after dark. Evelyn had been sitting in the same spot for hours, watching the light fade, listening to the town's sounds. Horses, voices, the tinny piano from the saloon. She'd been trying to formulate a plan. Step 1, don't panic. Step 2, she was still working on step 2. "Miss Hart," a woman's voice. "You in there?" Evelyn opened the door. A woman in her 40s stood in the hallway, wearing a practical dress and an expression of brisk efficiency. "I'm Dorothy Palmer. I own this hotel." "Mrs. Palmer." "Call me Dorothy. Everyone does." She held out a plate covered with a cloth. "Figured you might be hungry." The smell of food made Evelyn's stomach clench. She hadn't eaten since morning, and that had been stale bread and questionable cheese. "I can't pay for—" "Didn't ask you to. It's leftovers. Would have gone to the pigs otherwise." Dorothy pushed the plate into Evelyn's hands. "Eat. Then we'll talk." The food was simple. Beans, cornbread, a piece of ham, but it might as well have been a feast. Evelyn ate standing up, too hungry for manners. Dorothy watched from the doorway, arms folded. "You got plans?" Dorothy asked when the plate was empty. "Working on it." "Uh-huh. Let me guess. You're thinking maybe you can find work in town. Cleaning, cooking, that sort of thing. If there's work available." "There's not. Or not enough to matter. Town's got 3 women who do washing, 2 women who cook at the boarding house, and that's about it for respectable work. Everything else is at the saloon, and trust me, you don't want that." Evelyn knew what kind of work the saloon offered. "I'm educated. I can read, write, do figures. Surely someone needs. Someone might need, but they won't hire. You know why? Because I'm the abandoned bride. Because you're a woman alone." Dorothy's voice was matter-of-fact. "Out here, that's dangerous. Not because of what you are, but because of what men will think you are. Available, desperate, easy prey. You stick around this town without a husband or family, and you'll have 2 choices. Marry whoever will have you, or work the saloon. That's it. Those are your options." The words were brutal, but Evelyn didn't doubt their truth. She'd seen enough of the world to know that a woman alone was a woman vulnerable. "What would you suggest?" "Honestly, take what money you got left and go somewhere bigger. Denver, maybe, or back east. Small town like this, there's no place for a single woman except flat on her back one way or another." "I can't go back." "Then Denver, or California, somewhere with enough people that you can disappear into the crowd." Evelyn looked at the empty plate in her hands. $11. Maybe enough for a stage ticket somewhere, but then what? Arrive in a new city with nothing and no one? At least here she had, what? A hotel room for 11 nights? "Thank you for the advice," she said quietly. "And the food." Dorothy studied her for a long moment. "You're tougher than you look. I'll give you that. But tough only goes so far out here. Think about what I said." After Dorothy left, Evelyn lay on the lumpy bed and stared at the ceiling. Through the walls, she could hear voices, footsteps, the creaking of settling wood, the sounds of other people living their lives while hers fell apart. She must have slept because she woke to sunlight and the sound of shouting. The shouting came from the street. Evelyn went to the window and looked down. A crowd had gathered near the general store, mostly men, with a few women hovering on the edges. At the center stood Thomas Hendricks and another man, younger, broader, with dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the mountains themselves. "Don't care what you think you're owed," Thomas was saying, loud enough for half the town to hear. "The contract stipulated timely delivery. You missed the deadline." "By 2 days." "Because of the storm." The dark-haired man's voice was quieter, but it carried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command attention. You know damn well no freight moves during a blow like that. I know the contract specified May 1st. It's now May 3rd. That's breach of contract, Boone. Boone. Evelyn didn't recognize the name, but she recognized the type. Rancher, probably. The kind of man who worked with his hands, built things, made things happen through sheer force of will. The kind of man her mother would have called unsuitable. You want to talk breach of contract? Boone stepped closer. Let's talk about how you shorted me on last month's hay delivery, or how you've been cutting your cattle feed with sawdust, or, careful, Thomas's voice went sharp. That's slander. It's truth, and we both know it. The crowd murmured. Evelyn saw money changing hands. People were betting on whether this would come to blows. Thomas saw it too, and his face flushed. You'll get your payment when you deliver the lumber, Thomas said. Not before. That's final. Keep your payment. I'll sell elsewhere. There is no elsewhere. I'm the only buyer within 100 miles who can afford a shipment that size. Boone smiled, but there was no humor in it. Then I guess I'll wait for someone who can afford it and knows how to deal fairly. He turned to leave. Thomas grabbed his arm. We're not done. Boone looked at Thomas's hand on his arm, looked up at Thomas's face. Didn't say a word. Didn't have to. Thomas let go like he'd touched a hot stove. We're done, Boone said quietly, and walked away. The crowd dispersed, disappointed that no punches had been thrown. Evelyn watched Boone head down the street toward a wagon loaded with lumber. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and didn't need anyone's permission to be it. She envied that. God, did she envy that. Breakfast was bread and coffee at the hotel dining room, which cost 50 cents and made her wince. $10.80 left. The other guests, all men, traveling salesmen mostly, studiously ignored her. News of her humiliation had spread, apparently. Evelyn took her coffee to a table by the window and tried to think. Denver was 5 days by stage. The fare would take most of her remaining money. She'd arrive with maybe $2 and nowhere to stay. But staying here meant what? Working at the saloon? Finding some desperate man to marry? Neither option appealed. The door opened. Boone walked in, and the room's temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. He scanned the space, eyes passing over Evelyn without interest, and approached the clerk. Need to send a telegram, he said. To where? Helena, in Billings. Anyone buying lumber in bulk? The clerk nodded and pulled out the forms. Boone filled them out with quick, efficient movements. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who didn't hire other people to do his work. Evelyn looked away before he caught her staring. Through the window, she could see the main street stirring to life. A woman swept the boardwalk outside the general store. 2 men loaded a wagon. Normal people doing normal things, living normal lives. She wanted that. Normalcy. Stability. A life that didn't hinge on the whims of men like Thomas Hendricks. Miss Hart? She looked up. Dorothy stood by her table, holding a coffee pot. Mind if I sit? It's your hotel. Dorothy poured herself a cup and sat. Been thinking about your situation. And I might know someone who could help. If you're willing to consider something unconventional. Evelyn's stomach tightened. How unconventional? There's a man, rancher, lost his wife 2 years back. He's got land, resources, good reputation, but he's particular. Doesn't socialize much, keeps to himself. You're suggesting I marry a hermit. I'm suggesting you consider a business arrangement with a man who needs help running a ranch and might be willing to offer protection in exchange. Protection. The word tasted bitter. Is that what we're calling it? Call it what you want, but it's better than the alternatives. Dorothy leaned forward. Look, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying it's an option. You're smart, educated, capable. A man like that could use someone with your skills, and you'd have a roof, food, safety. And what would he get? Someone to manage the household, help with accounts, not be alone. Dorothy paused. His name's Caleb Boone, owns the Double B Ranch about 10 miles north. Good man, fair, doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, doesn't beat his animals, which is more than you can say for most men out here. Boone. The man from the street, the one who'd faced down Thomas without flinching. "Why would a man like that need to marry a desperate stranger?" Evelyn asked. "Because he's been alone too long, and it's starting to show. Ranch is suffering, house is falling apart. He needs help, but he's too proud to hire it and too stubborn to ask for it. But a wife?" Dorothy shrugged. "That's different. That's respectable. You've talked to him about this." "I mentioned you might be looking for options. He didn't say no." Evelyn looked out the window at the town that had already judged her and found her wanting. $10.80, maybe 11 days, maybe less. "I'd like to meet him," she heard herself say, "before I decide anything." Dorothy smiled. "He's right over there, at the clerk's desk." Evelyn's heart jumped. You already figured you'd want to move fast. Clock's ticking on that hotel room." Dorothy stood. "Come on. Might as well get this over with." She was already walking toward Boone before Evelyn could protest. Evelyn grabbed her coffee cup just to have something to hold and followed. "Caleb," Dorothy's voice was cheerful. "Got a minute?" Boone turned. Up close, he was even more imposing, taller than Evelyn had realized, with gray eyes that took in everything and revealed nothing. He looked at Evelyn, then at Dorothy, then back at Evelyn. "This the woman you mentioned?" he asked. "This is Miss Evelyn Hart. Evelyn Caleb Boone." "Ma'am." Boone touched his hat brim. Polite, but distant. Evelyn forced herself to meet his eyes. "Mr. Boone." An awkward silence stretched. Dorothy looked between them like a matchmaker at a social, which Evelyn supposed she was. "Dorothy suggested you might be looking for a business arrangement," Evelyn said finally. "Might be." Boone's expression didn't change. "Depends on the terms." "The terms being?" "I need someone to run the household, cook, clean, manage supplies, help with the books, if you're capable. In exchange, you'd have a home, protection, and your name on the deed as co-owner." The offer was so blunt it took her a moment to process. Co-owner. Partnership, legal and binding. You put in the work, you get a share of the ranch. And the marriage itself? In name, for respectability. He paused. Separate bedrooms. No expectations beyond the work itself. Evelyn studied him. He met her gaze without wavering, without the sliding eyes or false promises she'd come to expect from men. He was laying out terms like a business contract because that's what it was. No romance, no pretense. "Why me?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you traveled 2,000 miles on a promise. Takes guts. I know you didn't fall apart when that promise went bad. Takes strength. And I know you're standing here considering an offer from a stranger instead of running back east. Takes determination." He tilted his head slightly. "Those are the qualities I need in a partner. You're basing a marriage proposal on assumptions. You're considering a marriage proposal based on desperation. We're both gambling." The honesty of it was almost refreshing. No flowery words, no false promises. Just two people in difficult circumstances trying to find a solution that didn't destroy them both. "I'd want some conditions of my own," Evelyn said. Expected. "I want the right to leave if it doesn't work, with enough money to start over somewhere else." "Agreed. 6 months' wages in a separate account, yours to keep regardless." "I want my own space, a room I can lock. The house has 4 bedrooms. Take your pick. And I want to see the books before I agree to anything. If I'm going to be co-owner, I need to know what I'm getting into." For the first time, something that might have been approval flickered in Boone's eyes. "Fair enough. I can have them ready by this afternoon." "This afternoon?" Evelyn's pulse jumped. "No point dragging this out. Either we do business or we don't." He looked at Dorothy. "She can ride out with me after lunch. I'll show her the place, show her the books, answer whatever questions she has. If she's interested, we'll talk to the preacher tomorrow. If not, I'll bring her back and we'll forget the whole thing." It was happening too fast. Yesterday, she'd been planning a future with Thomas Hendricks. Today, she was negotiating a marriage contract with a stranger in the middle of a hotel dining room. But what choice did she have? Denver with $2, the saloon, crawling back to Philadelphia? "All right," Evelyn said. "This afternoon." Boone nodded once, sharp and final. "I'll pick you up at 1. He left without another word. Evelyn watched him go, feeling like she'd just agreed to jump off a cliff without checking how far down the ground was. Dorothy patted her shoulder. You did good. Caleb's a hard man, but he's a good man. You could do a lot worse. I already did do worse. Evelyn set down her coffee cup before her shaking hands could spill it. What have I just agreed to? A chance. That's more than you had an hour ago. At 1 o'clock, Caleb Boone pulled up in front of the hotel driving a wagon that had seen better days. Evelyn climbed up beside him, acutely aware of how close they were sitting, how alone they'd be for the next few hours. They drove in silence through town and out onto the open prairie. The mountains rose in the distance, still snow-capped despite it being May. The sky stretched overhead, bigger and bluer than any sky Evelyn had seen back east. You know how to ride? Boone asked after a while. Horses? No. You'll need to learn. Can't run a ranch if you can't get around it. Is the ranch very large? 2,000 acres, give or take. Evelyn tried to imagine 2,000 acres and failed. How many cattle? 500 head. Should be more, but I've been short-handed. What happened to your previous help? Moved on. Better opportunities elsewhere. Or so they said. Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but Evelyn didn't press. They barely knew each other. They were entitled to their secrets. The ranch appeared gradually, first fence lines, then pastures with grazing cattle, then a cluster of buildings. The main house was 2 stories, wood frame, with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. It needed paint, and the shutters hung crooked, but the bones were good. Boone helped her down from the wagon. House first, then the books. Inside the house was sad. That was the only word for it. Furniture covered in dust. Curtains faded and torn. Dishes stacked in the sink, some with food still crusted on them. It looked like someone had stopped caring and never started again. I know it's rough, Boone said. That's why I need help. Evelyn walked through the rooms, her practical mind cataloging what needed to be done. The kitchen required a thorough scrubbing. The parlor needed new curtains. The floors needed sweeping. The windows needed washing. The whole place needed everything. Upstairs, Boone showed her the bedrooms. Master bedroom's mine. You can take any of the others. She chose the one with the best light, south-facing, with windows overlooking the pastures. It had a bed, a dresser, and a chair. The mattress was dusty, but intact. The room was small, but it was hers. Back downstairs, Boone pulled out a ledger from a desk drawer. The books. Last 2 years. Evelyn sat and started reading. The numbers told a story. A ranch that had been thriving until about 2 years ago, then a gradual decline. Income down, expenses up, debts mounting. Nothing catastrophic yet, but heading that direction. Your wife died 2 years ago, she said quietly. Yes, and you've been trying to run this place alone since then. Hired help comes and goes. Can't keep anyone long enough to matter. Evelyn looked up at him. Because you don't trust them. Because the last person you trusted died and left you alone. Boone's expression hardened. That's none of your business. It is if I'm going to live here. If I'm going to be your partner. She closed the ledger. I need to know what I'm walking into, not just the numbers, the reality. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, her name was Sarah. We had 5 good years. Then she got sick, and 3 months later she was gone. I've been managing, barely. The ranch needs more than I can give it alone. And you think a stranger can fix that? I think 2 people working together can fix more than 1 person working alone. He leaned against the desk. I'm not offering you romance, Miss Hart. I'm offering you work. And a lot of it. But it's honest work. And at the end of it, you'll own half of something real. That's more than most women get. He was right. Evelyn knew he was right. A woman alone owned nothing, was nothing, except what men allowed her to be. But a partnership, a legal partnership with her name on a deed, that was power. That was security. I want one more condition, she said. Name it. If this doesn't work, if we can't stand each other, or if the ranch fails, or if anything goes wrong, I want your word that you won't stop me from leaving. No arguments, no guilt, no attempts to force me to stay. Boone extended his hand. You have my word. Evelyn looked at his hand, scarred, calloused, the hand of a man who'd worked for everything he had and wasn't afraid of more work. She shook it. His grip was firm, but not crushing. The grip of someone who knew his own strength and didn't need to prove it. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "We'll see the preacher." "Tomorrow morning," Boone agreed. He drove her back to town as the sun sank toward the mountains. Evelyn watched the landscape roll past and wondered what she'd just committed to. A marriage without love, a partnership without trust, a future built on nothing but mutual need and desperate hope. But it was a future. That was more than she'd had this morning. At the hotel, Boone helped her down from the wagon. "I'll pick you up at 9, he said. "I'll be ready." He tipped his hat and drove away, leaving Evelyn standing in the street with the setting sun painting everything gold. Tomorrow she'd marry a stranger. Tomorrow her life would change completely, again. But this time, she was choosing it. This time, she was walking in with her eyes open. That had to count for something. The preacher's house sat at the far end of town, a modest structure that doubled as the church on Sundays. Evelyn stood on the porch at 9 o'clock sharp, wearing the only decent dress she had left, dark blue wool that was too heavy for the weather, but presentable enough for a wedding. If you could call this a wedding. Caleb arrived in the same wagon, wearing what might have been his only clean shirt. He hadn't shaved, and the stubble on his jaw made him look harder than he had yesterday. More real, less like a business arrangement, and more like a man she was about to legally bind herself to. "Ready?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hands were shaking. She clasped them together to hide it. The preacher was a thin man with kind eyes, and the wariness of someone who'd seen too many desperate frontier marriages end badly. He looked between Evelyn and Caleb with obvious doubt. "You're sure about this?" he asked Evelyn directly. "You just got to town." "I'm sure." "And you, Caleb?" "This is awful sudden." "It's what needs doing," Caleb said flatly. The preacher sighed. "All right then. Let's get to it." The ceremony took maybe 5 minutes. Evelyn repeated words she barely heard, her mind buzzing with a kind of detached panic. Caleb's voice was steady when he spoke his vows, like he was reading from a contract, which she supposed he was. "You may kiss the bride," the preacher said without enthusiasm. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She looked back. Neither of them moved. "Or not," the preacher muttered. "You're married anyway. Sign here." Evelyn signed her name in the registry, watching the ink dry on Evelyn Boone. A new name, a new life, a new person she had no idea how to be. Outside, the morning sun was already brutal. Caleb handed her up into the wagon without ceremony. "We'll stop at the general store. You'll need supplies. I have some money left. Ranch account. You're co-owner now. That means you decide what we need and how much to spend on it." He flicked the reins and the wagon lurched forward. Within reason. The general store smelled like coffee and new fabric. The proprietor, a heavy-set man named Kowalski, looked up as they entered. His eyes widened when he saw them together. "Heard you two got hitched," he said. "That was quick work." "Need supplies," Caleb said, ignoring the comment. "Evelyn will tell you what." He left her there and went to examine horse tack on the far wall. Evelyn stood in the middle of the store, suddenly aware that every eye was on her. 2 women browsing fabric in the corner whispered behind their hands. A man buying nails grinned at her with knowing amusement. She wanted to run. Instead, she pulled out the list she'd made last night and started reading. Flour, 20 pounds, sugar, 10, coffee, 5, salt, baking powder, lard. Kowalski gathered the items while sneaking glances at her. "You settling in all right at the Double B?" "I haven't been there yet, officially." Right. Well, Caleb's a good man. Keeps to himself mostly, but solid. You could have done worse." Everyone kept saying that. You could have done worse. As if that was the standard she should be grateful to meet. "I'll need fabric too," she said, changing the subject. "Enough for curtains in the parlor and kitchen. And thread, needles. A good sewing kit, if you have one. Planning to spruce the place up?" "Planning to make it livable." Kowalski chuckled. "House has been looking rough since Sarah passed. Good to see someone taking it in hand." Evelyn added lamp oil, soap, and a new broom to the order. By the time she finished, the pile on the counter was substantial. Kowalski tallied it up with obvious pleasure. This was probably the biggest sale he'd had all month. $63.40, he announced. Evelyn's stomach dropped. That was more than she'd spent on anything in her entire life. She looked at Caleb, who had returned from examining the horse tack. "Put it on the ranch account," Caleb said without hesitation. "You sure? That's a lot of—" "She's buying what we need. That's what the account's for." Kowalski shrugged and marked it in his ledger. Caleb and Evelyn loaded the supplies into the wagon while the town watched. The women in the fabric corner had given up any pretense of shopping and were openly staring now. One of them, a redhead in an expensive-looking dress, stepped forward. "Mrs. Boone? I'm Victoria Hendricks." Of course she was. Of course Thomas's new wife would approach her here, in public, where everyone could see. "Mrs. Hendricks," Evelyn kept her voice neutral. "I wanted to say, well, I hope there are no hard feelings about Thomas. It wasn't personal." "Wasn't it?" Victoria had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I just meant that these things happen. People change their minds. It's unfortunate, but it's not anyone's fault." "It was someone's fault," Evelyn said quietly. "Your husband made promises he didn't keep. That's not fate. That's a choice." "Well, I'm sure you've landed on your feet." Victoria's eyes flicked to Caleb, who was securing the last of the supplies. "Mr. Boone has a lovely ranch." The implication was clear. You got what you came for anyway. A husband, a home. What are you complaining about? Evelyn wanted to throw something. Instead, she smiled. "Yes, I'm very fortunate." The words tasted like ash, but Victoria seemed satisfied. She nodded and returned to her friend, already whispering before she'd taken 3 steps. "Ready?" Caleb appeared at her elbow. "More than ready." They left town with Evelyn staring straight ahead, refusing to look back. Let them talk. Let them speculate. She had more important things to worry about than what Victoria Hendricks and her friends thought. The ride to the ranch took an hour. Caleb didn't talk much, which suited Evelyn fine. She was too busy trying not to panic about what came next. She was married to a stranger. She was going to live in a house in the middle of nowhere with a man she'd known for less than 2 days. This was either the bravest thing she'd ever done or the stupidest. Possibly both. At the ranch, Caleb pulled the wagon up to the house and started unloading. Evelyn helped, carrying sacks of flour and sugar into the kitchen. The dust was even worse in daylight. She could write her name on every surface. "I'll show you where everything goes," Caleb said. "Then I've got work to do. Fences need mending on the south pasture." "How long will that take?" "Most of the day, maybe longer." He paused, studying her. "You all right here alone?" "I managed alone in Philadelphia. I can manage here." "Philadelphia doesn't have wolves." "Do I need to worry about wolves?" "Not in daylight, and the rifle's above the door if you need it." He showed her a Winchester, oiled and ready. "You know how to shoot? No? I'll teach you. Later." He set the rifle back. "For now, just don't go wandering too far from the house." After Caleb left, Evelyn stood in the kitchen and looked around. The silence was enormous. Back in Philadelphia, there had always been noise, traffic, neighbors, the boarding house residents coming and going. Here there was nothing but wind and the occasional sound of cattle lowing in the distance. She could leave. The thought came unbidden. Caleb was gone. The wagon was right there. She could take it, drive back to town, use her remaining money to get on a stage to anywhere. But then what? She'd still be alone, still be broke, still be that woman who couldn't make anything work. At least here, she had a purpose. At least here, she could build something. Evelyn rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By sunset, the kitchen was clean. Not perfect. There were stains that wouldn't come out, gaps in the floorboards that no amount of sweeping would fix, but clean enough to cook in without feeling like she was inviting disease. She'd found a Dutch oven and made a simple stew with the vegetables she'd bought, letting it simmer while she tackled the parlor. Caleb came back just as darkness fell, looking exhausted. He smelled like sweat and horse and dirt. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the clean kitchen, the stew on the stove, the table that had been scrubbed until the wood showed through. "You've been busy," he said. "Sit, eat." Evelyn ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of him. "There's bread too, but it's store-bought. I'll bake tomorrow once I get the stove figured out." Caleb ate without speaking, methodically working through the bowl. Evelyn sat across from him with her own portion, equally silent. The only sound was spoons scraping bowls. "It's good," Caleb said finally. "Thank you." "You're welcome." More silence. Evelyn searched for something to say and came up empty. "What did you talk about with a husband who wasn't really a husband? The weather, the ranch, the fact that this whole situation was bizarre and uncomfortable and nothing like what either of them had probably imagined their lives would be?" "I'll need to know the routine," she said finally. "When you eat, what you prefer, when you work, so I can plan. I'm up at dawn, coffee and something quick for breakfast. Noon meal in the field most days, back by dark for dinner." He scraped the last of the stew from his bowl. "I'm not particular about food. Whatever's easiest." "And the hands? Do they eat here?" "No hands right now. Can't afford them." "You're running this whole ranch alone?" "I manage." But he didn't, not really. Evelyn had seen the ledgers. The ranch was bleeding money because there was too much work for one person. Cattle going unbranded, fences not mended, hay rotting in fields because there was no one to bring it in. "I can help," she said. "Not with the heavy work, but with organizing, making sure things don't fall through the cracks." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You ever worked on a ranch?" "No, but I kept books for a boarding house with 20 residents and a staff of 5. I know how to manage." "Managing a boarding house isn't the same as managing livestock." "No, but organizing is organizing. You tell me what needs doing and when, and I'll make sure it happens." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of respect. "All right, we'll try it." After dinner, Evelyn washed dishes while Caleb sat at the table working through paperwork. Invoices, she realized. Debts. He was calculating how much he owed and how much he could pay. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough." He didn't look up. "Thomas Hendricks holds paper on about 1/3 of my land. I miss a payment. He can foreclose." "Thomas has a mortgage on your ranch?" "His father-in-law does. Same thing. I borrowed to expand the herd 2 years ago. Seemed smart at the time." He laughed, bitter. "Then Sarah died, and I couldn't keep up. Been playing catch-up ever since." Evelyn dried her hands and sat across from him. "Let me see." He pushed the papers toward her. She read through them, her stomach sinking with each page. The debt was substantial, and the payment schedule was brutal. Caleb had been making minimums, barely keeping ahead of foreclosure. "The next payment is due when?" she asked. "End of the month. $1,500. "Do you have it?" "If I sell some cattle, but that leaves us short for winter feed." Evelyn tapped the papers, thinking. What if we didn't sell cattle? What if we found another way to make the payment? There is no other way. There's always another way. She grabbed a pencil and started calculating. You have lumber to sell. That's immediate cash. And if we can hire on some temporary hands for branding and roundup, we can bring the cattle to market at better weights, higher prices. Can't afford temporary hands. Can you afford to foreclose? Caleb's jaw tightened. No. Then we find the money. Cut costs somewhere else, defer something. But we don't sell breeding stock just to make a payment. That's cutting off our future to pay for our past. He stared at her. You've been here 6 hours and you're already telling me how to run my ranch? I'm your partner. That's what partners do. For a moment, she thought he'd argue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. You're right. Selling cattle now is stupid, but I don't see another option. Then we'll find one. Evelyn pulled the ledger closer. Walk me through the expenses, every single one. We'll figure out what's necessary and what's not. They worked until midnight, going through every line item, every debt, every asset. Caleb knew the ranch inside and out, but he'd been so focused on keeping things running day to day that he'd lost sight of the bigger picture. Evelyn could see it clearly, places where they were spending too much, places where a small investment would yield better returns, places where they were leaving money on the table. If we can get the lumber sold this week, that's $800, she said. Defer the equipment repair, that's another $200 saved. And if I take over the bookkeeping completely, you can spend less time on paperwork and more time on actual work. That's worth something. It's not enough. We're still short. Evelyn chewed her pencil, thinking. What about the hay you mentioned, the delivery Thomas shorted you on? What about it? He owes you. in product or in money. Either way, it's an asset. He'll never pay. You saw him. He doesn't think he owes me anything. Then we make him pay. Caleb raised an eyebrow. How exactly do you propose we do that? I don't know yet, but there has to be a way. Evelyn stood, her back aching from sitting so long. Let me think about it. Upstairs, she found her chosen bedroom looking exactly as she'd left it, dusty and unlived in. Too tired to do anything about it, she made the bed with the linens she'd bought, hung her few dresses in the wardrobe, and collapsed onto the mattress. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb moving around in his own room, the sound of boots hitting the floor, water being poured, the creak of bed springs. She was married to that man, legally bound. Her name was Evelyn Boone now, and this was her life. Sleep came hard, and when it did, it was full of dreams about drowning in paperwork while wolves circled outside. The next week fell into a rhythm that was equal parts exhausting and oddly satisfying. Evelyn woke before dawn with Caleb, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and sent him out with bread and cold meat for his noon meal. Then she attacked the house with the determination of someone trying to prove something, though whether to Caleb or to herself, she wasn't sure. She scrubbed floors until her knees were raw. She washed windows until they actually let in light. She sewed curtains from the fabric she'd bought, working by lamplight after dinner while Caleb dozed in his chair. The house slowly transformed from a tomb of grief into something that resembled a home. Caleb noticed. He didn't say much, but she caught him looking around with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe. Or relief. Or both. You didn't have to do all this, he said one evening, watching her hang the new parlor curtains. Yes, I did. I live here now. Still, it's more than we agreed to. We agreed to partnership. This is my part. She stepped back to assess the curtains. They were crooked. She adjusted them. Besides, I can't think in chaos. Never could. In the afternoons, while the house baked in the brutal heat, Evelyn worked on the books. She created systems where there had been none, organized receipts that had been stuffed in drawers, tracked expenses that Caleb had been estimating in his head. The more she learned about the ranch's finances, the more worried she became. They were closer to the edge than Caleb had admitted. One bad season, one major expense, and they'd lose everything. But she also saw potential. The land was good. The water was reliable. The cattle, though thin, were healthy. If they could just get through this rough patch, they could build something solid. She was deep in receipts one afternoon when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses. Evelyn went to the window and saw 3 men riding up to the house. Caleb was out in the far pasture. She'd watched him ride out that morning, heading for the fence line that needed mending. The men dismounted. One of them knocked on the door. Evelyn's mouth went dry. Caleb had told her not to answer the door when she was alone, but he'd also told her she was co-owner of this ranch. She couldn't hide every time someone showed up. She grabbed the rifle from above the door, not to use, just to have, and opened it. The man on the porch was tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had lost a fight with a fence post. The 2 behind him were younger, harder, with the kind of eyes that sized you up and found you wanting. Help you? Evelyn kept the rifle pointed at the floor but visible. Looking for Caleb Boone, the man said. His eyes flicked to the rifle and back to her face. You his wife? I am, and you are. Name's Dutch Keller. I run cattle on the land adjacent to this property. He smiled, showing teeth that had seen better days. Just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. That's kind of you. I'll tell my husband you stopped by. No need to rush me off. Thought we might talk a bit. Get to know each other. Something in his tone set off alarms. My husband will be back soon. You can talk to him then. Thing is, I came to talk to you specifically. Keller leaned against the porch post. Too comfortable, too familiar. See, word is you're the one handling the books now, figures and such. That right? That's right. Well then, you're the one I need to discuss payment with. Evelyn's grip on the rifle tightened. Payment for what? Water rights. My cattle use the creek that runs through Boone's land. Always have. Your husband and I had an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Verbal? Friendly-like? But now that there's a new Mrs. Boone, I figure we should make it official. Say, $50 a month for access? It was a lie. Evelyn didn't know how she knew, but she knew. Caleb had never mentioned any arrangement with Keller, and $50 a month was absurd for water access. "I'll need to discuss this with my husband," she said. "Your husband's been running this place into the ground for 2 years. That's why he needed to buy himself a wife, right?" Keller's smile widened. "Now, I'm trying to help you out here. 50 a month is cheap for what you're getting, and it'd be a shame if something happened to that creek. A lot of things can go wrong with water sources." The threat was clear. Pay up or we'll ruin your water. Evelyn's fear crystallized into anger. She'd dealt with men like this before, back in Philadelphia, creditors who'd tried to intimidate her father, customers who'd thought a woman alone was easy prey. They all had the same tell. They pushed until you pushed back. She raised the rifle, not aiming at anyone, just bringing it up so it rested in her arms. Visible, ready. "Mr. Keller, I appreciate the visit, but we have no arrangement with you, verbal or otherwise, and we won't be extorted on our own land. Now I suggest you leave before my husband gets back, and we have a different kind of conversation." Keller's smile faded. "That's unfriendly. That's business. Good day." She stepped back and closed the door, then locked it. Through the window, she watched Keller and his men mount up. They didn't leave immediately. They sat there, staring at the house, talking amongst themselves. Then finally, they rode off. Evelyn set the rifle down with shaking hands. Her heart was hammering so hard she felt sick. When Caleb came home that evening, she told him what had happened. His face went dark. "Keller's been trying that same trick for months," he said. "Claims we owe him for one thing or another. It's all lies." "Why didn't you warn me?" "Didn't think he'd come when I wasn't here." Caleb's jaw clenched. "He won't make that mistake again." "What are you going to do?" "Talk to him. Make it clear you're off limits. I can handle myself." "I know you can." "You proved that today." He looked at her with something close to approval. "But that doesn't mean you should have to." The next morning, Caleb rode out early and didn't come back until afternoon. When he did, his knuckles were scraped and there was blood on his shirt that didn't look like his own. "Did you—" Evelyn started. "Keller and I came to an understanding," Caleb said flatly. "He won't bother you again." He didn't elaborate, and Evelyn didn't ask. Some things were better left unknown. But that night at dinner, Caleb said, "You did good yesterday. Most women would have panicked. Most women aren't trying to keep a ranch from foreclosure." He almost smiled. True enough. It was the closest thing to praise she'd gotten from him, and it felt better than it should have. Sunday, they went to town for church. Evelyn wore her blue dress again. It was that, or the work dress she'd been wearing all week, and neither was appropriate, but the blue was cleaner. Caleb wore his wedding shirt, still the only clean one he had. The church was packed, which surprised Evelyn. Apparently, frontier people took their religion seriously, or at least took the opportunity to socialize seriously. Every head turned when they walked in. The whispers started immediately. They sat in the back. The preacher launched into a sermon about duty and perseverance that felt pointed enough that Evelyn wondered if he'd written it specifically for them. Around them, people sang hymns and prayed and pretended not to stare. After the service, Victoria Hendricks made a beeline for them. She was dressed in pink silk that probably cost more than Evelyn's entire wardrobe, and she had Thomas on her arm like a prize. "Mrs. Boone," Victoria said warmly, "so lovely to see you settling in. And Caleb, you're looking well." "Victoria," Caleb said with obvious reluctance, "we should have you over for dinner sometime. Get to know each other properly." "We're busy," Evelyn said. Of course. Running a ranch is such hard work." Victoria's smile was all teeth. "But surely you can spare one evening. I'd love to hear how you're adjusting. It must be so different from city life." "It's different," Evelyn agreed. "Better, actually. More honest." The barb landed. Victoria's smile froze. "Well, how nice for you." Thomas, who'd been silent, finally spoke. "Heard you turned away Dutch Keller the other day." Word traveled fast. "He had no business with us." "Keller's connected. Important family. You might want to be more careful about making enemies." "I'll keep that in mind," Evelyn said coldly. Caleb put his hand on her elbow. "We should go." They left the church with everyone watching, and Evelyn felt a surge of satisfaction. Let them talk. Let Victoria and Thomas and the whole town see that she wasn't broken, wasn't desperate, wasn't going to bow and scrape for their approval. On the ride home, Caleb said, "You made an enemy today." "I made an enemy the day Thomas left me stranded. Victoria's just upset I didn't crawl into a hole and disappear. People like the Hendricks can cause problems." "Let them try." Caleb glanced at her, and this time he definitely smiled. "You're tougher than you look." "I have to be. The world doesn't give women any other choice." That week, Evelyn focused on the lumber sale. She drafted a letter to buyers in Helena and Billings, laying out exactly what they had and what price they'd accept. Caleb read it over and made a few changes, but mostly he left it alone. "You write better than I do," he admitted. "I had a good education before everything fell apart." "What happened? To your family?" Evelyn hadn't talked about this with anyone in years. But here, in the kitchen with the lamp burning low, and Caleb actually listening, the words came easier than expected. "My father was a doctor, good at his work, bad with money. He invested in schemes that never panned out, loaned money to friends who never paid him back. When he died, the debts came due. We lost everything, the house, the practice, everything. My mother remarried quickly, a man who didn't want a grown stepdaughter around, so I left. That's why you answered the advertisement. That's why I couldn't go back when Thomas changed his mind. There was nothing to go back to." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "My father drank himself to death when I was 16, left me and my mother with a failing homestead and debts to half the county. I worked like a dog for 10 years to pay them off and build something better. Then I met Sarah, and for a while everything was good. Then she died and it all went to hell again." He looked at the ledger on the table. "Seems like we're both trying to outrun the past, or build something better than it. Maybe, if we can pull it off." 3 days later, a buyer from Helena sent a telegram. He'd take the lumber at the price Caleb had asked, cash on delivery. It was the break they needed. Caleb took the wagon to Helena himself, not trusting anyone else with that much potential money. He left before dawn and wouldn't be back until the next day. Evelyn was alone again, but this time it felt different. Less like abandonment, more like trust. She spent the day working on the books, trying to find more places to cut costs. By evening, she had a plan that might, just might, get them through the next 6 months without selling cattle. She was making dinner when she heard the horses again. Her stomach dropped. Not again. She grabbed the rifle and went to the window. It wasn't Keller this time. It was worse. Thomas Hendricks sat on a fine bay horse, looking like he owned the world. Behind him were 2 men Evelyn didn't recognize, both armed. She met him on the porch with the rifle in her hands. "What do you want, Thomas?" He had the decency not to smile. "I want to talk business. May I come in?" "No." "It's important." "Then talk from there," Thomas sighed. "Fine. I'm calling in the note on this property. Full payment is due in 2 weeks. Evelyn's blood went cold. "That's not what the contract says. Next payment isn't due until end of month." "I'm invoking the acceleration clause. Missed payments, deteriorating collateral. I have grounds." "We haven't missed any payments." "You've made minimum payments. That's not the same as keeping current. And I've had the property assessed. It's worth less than the outstanding debt. That gives me the right to demand full payment." It was a trick. A legal trick, buried in the fine print. Evelyn wanted to scream. "We'll contest it," she said. "You can try, but by the time it gets through court, you'll be foreclosed anyway." Thomas leaned forward in his saddle. "Or you can make this easy. Deed over the property, and I'll forgive the debt. You and Caleb can walk away clean. This land is our home. This land is collateral on a debt you can't pay. Be smart, Evelyn. Cut your losses." The way he said her name, familiar, condescending, made her want to shoot him. Instead, she raised the rifle. "Get off our land!" Thomas's expression hardened. 2 weeks. Then the sheriff comes. Think about it. He rode away, leaving Evelyn shaking with rage and fear. When Caleb came home the next day with the money from the lumber sale, she told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his face like stone. "He can't do this," she finished. "Can he?" "If the contract has an acceleration clause, yes, and knowing Thomas's father-in-law, it does." Caleb sat heavily at the table. We're finished. No. Evelyn grabbed the ledger. We have 800 from the lumber. How much do we need total? 15,000. Even with what we've been paying, the principal is still 12,000. The number was crushing, impossible. But Evelyn had seen impossible before. She'd been stranded in a strange town with $11 and no prospects, and she'd survived. She'd build this. Then we have 2 weeks to find $12,000, she said. Caleb laughed, bitter and tired. Sure, we'll just pull it out of thin air. Or we fight dirty. What? Evelyn's mind was racing. Thomas wants this land. Why? Because he's a bastard who enjoys crushing people. No, there has to be more. Nobody goes to this much trouble just for spite. She started pulling out maps, documents, anything that might give her a clue. What's special about this land? They searched until midnight and found it buried in an old survey report. The railroad was coming through. Not now, maybe not for years, but eventually. And when it did, it would run right through the northern section of Caleb's land, the section with the best water, the flattest ground, the easiest route through the mountains. Thomas knew. Somehow, he knew. And he wanted the land before Caleb realized what it was worth. This changes everything, Evelyn said. How? We still can't pay. No, but we can make sure Thomas doesn't get it either. She smiled, and for the first time since arriving in Montana, it was genuine. How do you feel about fighting back? Caleb stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Fighting back how? We don't have the money, and we don't have the time. No, but we have something Thomas wants, and we have information he doesn't know we have. Evelyn spread the survey documents across the table. He's counting on us rolling over, expecting us to panic and hand over the deed just to avoid foreclosure. What if we don't? Then we lose everything in court. Not if we make the land worthless to him first. Caleb leaned back, arms crossed. I'm listening. Evelyn's mind was working faster than it had in years, pieces clicking together like a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. Thomas wants this land because of the railroad. But the railroad needs more than just a route. They need water rights, timber access, cooperation from landowners. If we make ourselves difficult, if we tie up the water rights, sell off timber to other buyers, contest every inch of the survey, we can make this property a nightmare for him to develop. That buys us what? A few months of him hating us more than he already does? It buys us leverage. Thomas doesn't want to fight. He wants an easy acquisition. So we make it hard, so hard that it's cheaper to renegotiate with us than to force us out. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying the maps. You're talking about a war. I'm talking about survival. Same thing out here, isn't it? He almost smiled at that. You really think this could work? I think it's better than giving up. Evelyn pulled the ledger closer. We have 800 from the lumber. That's enough to hire a lawyer, at least for a consultation. Someone who can tell us exactly what Thomas can and can't do with that acceleration clause. Lawyers cost money we don't have. Everything costs money we don't have. That's never stopped us before. She was surprised by how steady her voice sounded, considering her heart was trying to hammer its way out of her chest. I say we go to Helena tomorrow, talk to a lawyer, see what our options really are. Caleb looked at her for a long time, something shifting in his expression. Respect, maybe. Or the beginning of actual partnership instead of just a business arrangement. All right, we'll go to Helena. They left before dawn, taking the wagon because Evelyn still couldn't ride worth a damn. The journey was long and dusty, and by the time they reached Helena, her back ached and her dress was coated in a fine layer of grit. The city was bigger than Salvation Creek, more organized, with actual brick buildings and paved streets. It still felt like the edge of nowhere, but at least it was a civilized edge. The lawyer's office sat above a dry goods store, accessed by an exterior staircase that looked like it might collapse under their weight. A painted sign read, J. Morrison, Attorney at Law. Inside, a clerk with ink-stained fingers looked up from a massive desk covered in papers. Help you? We need to see Mr. Morrison, Caleb said, about a land contract. The clerk glanced between them, taking in their dusty clothes and work-worn hands. Mr. Morrison's rates start at $50 for a consultation. Evelyn pulled out the money from the lumber sale and counted out 50 in bills. Then we'd like a consultation. The clerk's eyebrows rose, but he took the money and disappeared into the back office. A moment later, a man emerged, mid-40s, balding, with the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen every trick in the book and invented a few of his own. James Morrison. He shook their hands with a grip that was firmer than expected. You're the Boones? Caleb and Evelyn. We have a problem. Morrison listened without interrupting as they laid out the situation. The mortgage, the acceleration clause, Thomas's ultimatum. He took notes, asked pointed questions, and requested to see the contract. Caleb had brought it, folded and worn from being read too many times. Morrison studied it for a long time, his expression giving nothing away. Finally, he set it down and looked at them. He's got you. The acceleration clause is ironclad. If he invokes it, you'll owe the full balance immediately. Evelyn's stomach sank. There's nothing we can do? I didn't say that. I said he's got you on the contract. But there are other ways to fight. Morrison tapped the document. First, you file for an extension based on hardship. Won't win, but it'll buy you time. Maybe 2 months if the judge is sympathetic. Second, you challenge his assessment of the property value. Force him to prove deterioration. That's another month, minimum. Third, and this is the tricky part, you make yourself more valuable as partners than as enemies. How? Caleb asked. Railroad's coming through. You know it, he knows it. But what he might not know is that you're willing to play ball. Tell him you'll grant easements, sell right-of-way, whatever he needs, for a price that includes forgiving your debt and letting you keep the land. He'll never go for it, Evelyn said. Maybe not, but it puts you at the negotiating table instead of under his boot. And that's worth something. Morrison leaned back in his chair. Here's the thing about men like Thomas Hendricks. They're bullies. They push until someone pushes back. You push back hard enough, they usually prefer to deal rather than fight. And if he doesn't prefer to deal, Caleb's voice was flat, then you lose, and you start over somewhere else. But at least you go down swinging. Morrison pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I can file the motions for you, $300, and that includes representation through the first hearing. $300. More than half of what they'd gotten for the lumber. Evelyn looked at Caleb, saw the same calculation happening in his eyes. Do it, she said before Caleb could speak. Morrison nodded. I'll need signatures and a retainer today. They signed. Evelyn counted out the 300, watching their safety net shrink to almost nothing. When they left the office, they had less than $500 and a lawyer who might or might not be able to save them. That was a gamble, Caleb said as they climbed back into the wagon. Everything we've done since we met has been a gamble. True enough. He flicked the reins and the wagon lurched forward. But this one feels bigger. On the way back, they stopped at a telegraph office. Evelyn drafted a message to every lumber buyer within 200 miles, offering timber rights from the northern section of Caleb's land. Not selling the land itself, just the right to harvest timber. It would bring in quick cash and, more importantly, would complicate any railroad plans Thomas had. Let him try to build through a forest that someone else was actively logging. You're vicious when you want to be, Caleb observed as she handed the messages to the clerk. I'm practical. There's a difference. Not much of one. They reached the ranch after dark, both exhausted. But instead of heading straight to bed, Evelyn lit the lamps and pulled out the maps again. If they were going to fight, they needed to know every advantage they had. Show me the property lines, she said. All of them, and where the water sources are. Caleb traced them with his finger, pointing out creeks and springs, fence lines, and access roads. Evelyn made notes, drawing her own rough map with annotations. The more she studied it, the more she realized how valuable this land really was. 3 separate water sources, timber, grazing, and that railroad route that would make someone a fortune. We could sell the timber rights for $5,000, maybe more, she said, calculating. That plus what we have might be enough to convince Thomas we're serious about fighting, or it might just make him angrier. Let him be angry. Angry people make mistakes. Caleb looked at her with something close to admiration. Where'd you learn to think like this? Philadelphia. My father's creditors taught me that the only way to deal with bullies is to have something they want and be willing to destroy it rather than hand it over. She set down her pencil. Thomas thinks we're desperate. We are desperate, but desperate doesn't mean powerless. The next morning, Evelyn woke to shouting outside. She grabbed her robe and ran downstairs to find Caleb on the porch, facing down 3 men on horseback. Not Keller this time. Not Thomas. Someone new. "What's going on?" she asked. "This gentleman claims we're trespassing on his land," Caleb said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a scar across his cheek, sneered. "Not trespassing. Squatting. This property reverted to the bank last week when you missed your payment." "We haven't missed a payment," Evelyn said. "Bank says different, and I got papers here that say I'm the new owner." He pulled out a folded document. "So you got until tomorrow to clear out." Evelyn snatched the paper from his hand and read it. It was a foreclosure notice, dated 4 days ago, claiming default on the mortgage. It was also completely fraudulent. She'd checked the records herself. They were current on all payments. "This is a fake," she said. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling this document fraudulent. We've made every payment on time. I have receipts." The man's smile widened. "Receipts don't mean nothing if the bank says you didn't pay. Now you can leave peaceful, or we can make it unpleasant. Your choice." Caleb stepped forward. "This is my land. I've got the deed, the mortgage papers, everything legal. You're not taking it." "Already took it. We're just here to collect." The man gestured to his companions. "Boys, start with the barn. See what's worth keeping." They dismounted. Evelyn's heart hammered. This was happening. They were actually going to steal everything. "Stop!" Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I'm writing to Helena right now to get our lawyer. If you touch one thing on this property, I'll have the sheriff here by nightfall." The man laughed. "Sheriff's in Thomas Hendricks's pocket, sweetheart. Everyone knows that." "Then I'll go to the territorial governor, the federal marshal, whoever I have to." Evelyn stood her ground, even though her legs were shaking. "But I'm not letting you rob us." Something in her tone made the man pause. He looked at Caleb, then back at Evelyn, reassessing. "You got 24 hours to get your lawyer," he said finally. "But come tomorrow. If you're still here, we're taking possession, one way or another." They rode off, leaving Evelyn and Caleb standing in the yard. "That was Thomas," Caleb said quietly. "He's not waiting for the legal fight. He's just taking it." "Then we don't wait either." Evelyn was already moving, heading back inside. "Pack what you need. We're going to Helena. Now." "Evelyn." "Now, Caleb." They made it to Helena by late afternoon, pushing the horses harder than they should have. Morrison's office was still open, thank God. Evelyn burst through the door, the fake foreclosure notice clutched in her hand. "They're trying to steal the ranch," she said without preamble. "Today. Right now." Morrison read the document, his expression darkening. "This is forgery. Blatant forgery." "Can you stop them?" "I can file an emergency injunction. Get a judge to freeze any transfer of property until we sort this out." He was already pulling out forms. "But I'll need to file today. Right now." "Do it." Morrison worked fast, his pen scratching across legal forms while Evelyn paced and Caleb stood silent by the window. Within an hour, they were standing in front of a judge's chambers, Morrison arguing their case while a lawyer for the bank, Thomas's father-in-law's bank, sputtered protests. The judge was an older man, weathered and skeptical. He read the foreclosure notice, read Morrison's filing, and looked at Evelyn and Caleb over his spectacles. "You're claiming fraud?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Morrison said. "My clients have receipts for every payment. The bank's notice is false." "Bank says they lost the receipts in a fire," the opposing lawyer said smoothly. "Can't verify payment without documentation." "Convenient," Evelyn said before she could stop herself. The judge's eyebrow rose. "Young lady, this is a courtroom." "And that's a lie, Your Honor. There was no fire." "The bank is trying to steal our property because they know it's going to be worth a fortune when the railroad comes through." The opposing lawyer's face went pale. Morrison shot her a look that said, "Shut up," but the damage was done. Or maybe the advantage. The judge was staring at her with sudden interest. "The railroad," he repeated. "Yes, Your Honor. They're planning a route right through our land. Thomas Hendricks knows it. That's why he's trying to force us out before we can realize what we have." The judge looked at the opposing lawyer. "Is this true?" "I have no knowledge of any railroad plans." But you represent Hendrix's bank, and you're here trying to foreclose on property that happens to be in the path of a major development. That strikes me as quite a coincidence. The lawyer stammered something about business decisions and market values. The judge cut him off. I'm granting a temporary injunction. No transfer of property, no foreclosure proceedings, until we can verify these payment records. He banged his gavel. 30 days. Both parties will present documentation. If the Boones can prove payment, this foreclosure is dismissed with prejudice. If they can't, the bank gets the property. Clear? Yes, Your Honor, Morrison said quickly. Outside the courthouse, Morrison turned on Evelyn. What were you thinking? You never volunteer information in front of a judge. I was thinking we needed him on our side, and now he is. Or now he thinks you're a conspiracy theorist. He granted the injunction, didn't he? Morrison sighed. Yes, but you got lucky. Don't make a habit of it. They stayed in Helena that night, too tired to make the journey back. Morrison recommended a boarding house that was cheap and relatively clean. Evelyn and Caleb took separate rooms, maintaining appearances, even though by now everyone knew their marriage was a business arrangement. Lying in bed in a strange room, listening to the sounds of an unfamiliar city, Evelyn felt something shift inside her. A month ago, she'd been a nobody, stranded and humiliated. Now she was fighting one of the most powerful men in the territory and holding her own. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like coming alive. The next morning, they returned to the ranch to find it untouched. The fake foreclosure team hadn't come back. Morrison's injunction had worked, at least temporarily, but the relief was short-lived. That afternoon, a rider came with a message from Thomas. It was brief and to the point. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'll give you one last chance. Sell me the land for fair value, or I'll bury you in legal fees until you have nothing left. Evelyn read it twice, then crumpled it up and threw it in the stove. No response? Caleb asked. He'll get his response when we win. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked like they'd never worked before. Caleb managed the ranch while Evelyn organized their defense, gathering every receipt, every record, every piece of documentation that proved they'd paid their mortgage on time. She found payment logs from the bank itself, carbon copies that some clerk had failed to destroy. She found canceled checks. She found a letter from the bank acknowledging receipt of payment, dated just 3 weeks before the fake foreclosure notice. It was enough, more than enough. But Thomas wasn't done. He filed a counterclaim, arguing that the land was being mismanaged, that Caleb was an unfit steward, that the property value was declining under his care. He brought in assessors who swore the ranch was worth half what it had been 2 years ago. He found former workers who claimed Caleb was difficult, unreliable, drunk on the job, all lies, but documented lies. Morrison fought back, but it was clear this was becoming exactly what Thomas had promised, a war of attrition designed to bleed them dry. We're spending money faster than we're making it, Caleb said one night, staring at the ledger. Legal fees, court costs, witnesses. Even if we win, we'll be broke. Then we need to make money faster. Evelyn was exhausted, her eyes burning from reading contracts by lamplight, but she couldn't stop now. The timber rights, did any of the buyers respond? 2. One offered $3,000, the other $4,000. Take the $4,000 today. That timber's our reserve. If we have a bad year, if we lose this case, we won't have any years, bad or good. Sell it. Caleb sold the timber rights the next day. $4,000 paid in cash. It gave them breathing room, but not much. Morrison's fees kept climbing, and Thomas kept filing new motions, new challenges, new obstacles. Then, 3 days before their court date, the storm hit. It came out of nowhere, a wall of black clouds rolling over the mountains like the end of the world. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. The wind picked up, howling through the eaves like something alive and angry. We need to get the cattle to shelter, Caleb said, already pulling on his coat. The storm breaks while they're scattered. We'll lose half the herd. I'll help. You don't know how, but... Then teach me fast. They rode out together, Evelyn clinging to the saddle like her life depended on it, which it probably did. The cattle were scattered across the south pasture, grazing peacefully, unaware of what was coming. Caleb started rounding them up, shouting instructions that Evelyn only half understood. The first drops of rain hit like bullets. Within minutes, it was a downpour. Lightning cracked across the sky, so close Evelyn could smell the ozone. Thunder followed, deafening. The cattle panicked. They scattered in every direction, wild-eyed and terrified. Caleb was everywhere at once, trying to turn them, trying to drive them toward the barn. But there were too many, and they were too scared. "Evelyn, get to the north fence," Caleb's voice barely carried over the storm. "Turn them back toward me." She didn't know how to turn cattle. She didn't even know how to ride properly. But she dug her heels into the horse's flanks and charged toward the north fence, waving her arms and screaming at the stampeding animals. It was chaos. Pure, terrifying chaos. Cattle running in every direction, rain so heavy she could barely see, lightning turning everything into stark snapshots of disaster. Then she heard the crack. A tree, struck by lightning, came crashing down directly in front of a group of cattle. They veered sharply, heading straight for a washout that would break their legs if they hit it at full speed. Evelyn didn't think. She just moved, urging her horse between the cattle and the washout, screaming and waving until her throat was raw. The cattle turned, barely, and thundered past her so close she could feel their heat. She looked for Caleb and saw him on the ground. Her heart stopped. She kicked her horse into a gallop, reaching him in seconds. He was conscious but bleeding, a gash on his forehead where something had hit him. His horse stood nearby, reins dragging, eyes rolling white with fear. "I'm fine," Caleb said, trying to stand. He wasn't fine. He could barely put weight on his left leg. "Like hell you are." Evelyn dismounted and grabbed his arm, hauling him up. "Can you ride? Can you get the cattle?" "Forget the cattle. You're bleeding. Evelyn. Now Caleb." She got him onto his horse through sheer stubbornness and tied his hands to the saddle horn so he wouldn't fall off. Then she mounted her own horse and looked at the scattered herd. There had to be 300 head out there, spooked and running wild. If she lost them, the ranch was finished. If she stayed to help Caleb, the ranch was finished. She had to choose. Evelyn looked at Caleb slumped in his saddle, barely conscious. Then she looked at the cattle disappearing into the storm. "Can you make it to the house?" she asked. "I think so." "Then go. I'll get the cattle." "You can't. Go!" She slapped his horse on the rump, sending it toward the ranch house. Then she turned back to the storm and the scattered herd and the impossible task ahead of her. She'd come to Montana looking for safety, for security, for a life that made sense. Instead, she'd found this: rain and lightning and 500 pounds of terrified beef trying to kill themselves in a washout. Evelyn kicked her horse forward and started screaming at the cattle again, driving them, turning them, forcing them toward the barn through sheer force of will. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't have the skills or the experience or any business being out here alone. But she was done waiting for rescue. Done hoping someone else would fix things. If this ranch was going to survive, it would be because she made it survive. The storm raged on, and Evelyn rode into it like she'd been born to it. The rain turned the ground to soup. Evelyn's horse slipped twice, nearly throwing her both times, but she held on with her thighs burning and her hands cramped around the reins. The cattle were everywhere, dark shapes moving through sheets of water, bawling with fear. She had no idea what she was doing. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to get to shelter, to let the damn animals fend for themselves. But if they lost the herd, they lost everything. All the fighting, all the legal battles, all of it would be for nothing if 300 head of cattle scattered across the territory or broke their legs in the storm. A heifer broke from the group running blind toward the ravine. Evelyn charged after it, her horse's hooves throwing up mud, and cut it off just before the drop. The animal wheeled, confused, and ran back toward the others. Small victory. About 299 more to go. Lightning struck a cottonwood 30 yards away. The crack was so loud it felt like being hit. Evelyn's horse reared and she barely stayed on, her wet hands slipping on the reins. When the horse came down, it was trembling, ready to bolt. "Easy," she said, her voice shaking as badly as the animal beneath her. "Easy, easy." She didn't know the horse's name. Caleb had just pointed to it this morning and said, "That one's gentle enough." Gentle. Right. The horse was one good lightning strike away from dumping her in the mud and running for the next county. But it steadied, and Evelyn urged it forward again, toward the main group of cattle that was milling in confusion near the creek. The creek was rising fast, brown water churning. If the cattle crossed now, some would get swept away. She had to turn them. Evelyn rode straight at them, screaming wordlessly, waving her arms like a madwoman. The cattle shifted, uncertain. She pushed harder, her horse responding to her panic with its own nervous energy. The cattle began to move slowly at first, then faster, away from the creek and toward higher ground. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Then she saw the fence. The north fence line, the one that separated their property from Keller's land, was down. A section maybe 20 feet wide had collapsed, probably from the wind or a fallen tree, and half the herd was heading straight for it, about to scatter onto Keller's range where she'd never get them back. Evelyn's mind raced. She couldn't fix the fence in this storm. She couldn't stop 300 cattle by herself, but she could redirect them, maybe, if she could get ahead of the leaders and turn them before they reached the gap. She kicked her horse into a gallop, mud flying, rain blinding her. The horse slipped, caught itself, kept running. They pulled ahead of the herd, and Evelyn wheeled around, putting herself between the cattle and the gap. The lead steer saw her and slowed. The others bunched up behind it, confused by this obstacle. Evelyn held her ground, her horse dancing nervously, every muscle in her body screaming that this was insane, that she was going to get trampled. The steer lowered its head. For a terrible moment, Evelyn thought it would charge. Then it turned, moving parallel to the fence line instead of through the gap. The others followed, and Evelyn exhaled a breath she hadn't known she was holding. But they were still moving, still panicked, and she still had to get them to the barn. She followed, pushing them, guiding them, correcting their path every time they tried to scatter. Her clothes were soaked through, her hands were numb. She'd lost feeling in her feet an hour ago. The barn appeared through the rain like a miracle. Evelyn drove the cattle toward it, into the larger paddock that Caleb had reinforced last week. The animals crowded in, seeking shelter, and Evelyn dismounted on legs that barely held her. She closed the gate, her fingers fumbling with the latch, and leaned against it, gasping. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. The house was dark when she led her horse to the stable. She unsaddled with shaking hands, rubbed the animal down as best she could, and stumbled toward the porch. Inside, a single lamp burned in the kitchen. Caleb sat at the table, his head bandaged, his leg propped on a chair. "You got them," he said. Not a question. A statement. "Most of them, I think. I couldn't count in the dark." Evelyn peeled off her soaked coat and let it drop. "How's your head?" "I'll live. How are you?" "Ask me tomorrow when I can feel my body again." She made coffee, her hands still trembling, and poured them each a cup. The hot liquid burned going down, but it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. They sat in silence, listening to the storm rage outside, both too exhausted to speak. "You shouldn't have done that," Caleb said finally. "Could have been killed out there." "Huh? So could you. And then where would we be?" "I know what I'm doing. You don't." "I learned fast." Evelyn set down her cup. "Look, I didn't come out here to be decoration. I came to be a partner. That means doing what needs doing, whether I know how or not." Caleb studied her with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you. What did you expect?" "Honestly, a lonely old man who needed someone to cook and clean and stay quiet." She managed a tired smile. "Turns out you're just lonely and stubborn and possibly insane for trying to fight Thomas Hendricks." "We're both fighting him now." "Yeah, we are." Something passed between them in that moment, something that hadn't been there before. Not attraction exactly. They were both too exhausted for that. But recognition, respect, the understanding that they were in this together, for real now, not just on paper. Caleb reached across the table and squeezed her hand once, brief and awkward. "Thank you for today." "Don't thank me yet. We still have to win in court." "We will." Evelyn wished she had his confidence. The court date was tomorrow, and she had no idea if Morrison had enough evidence to beat Thomas's lawyers. But tonight, she was too tired to worry. Tonight, she just wanted to sleep and not think about everything that could go wrong. She went upstairs, stripped off her wet clothes, and collapsed into bed. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb moving around, probably struggling with his injured leg. She should help him, but her body refused to move, and within minutes, she was asleep. She dreamed of cattle and lightning and a voice that sounded like her mother's saying over and over, "You were supposed to be better than this. You were supposed to be someone." Evelyn woke before dawn, her body one giant bruise. Everything hurt. Muscles she didn't know she had were screaming in protest. But the storm had passed, and through her window she could see pale sunlight breaking through the clouds. Downstairs, Caleb was already up, limping around the kitchen making coffee. The bandage on his head was clean, which meant he'd changed it himself. His left leg was wrapped tight, and he was favoring it heavily. "You should rest," Evelyn said. "Can't. Got to check the damage from the storm. See what we lost." He handed her a cup of coffee. "And we have court in 3 hours." Right. Court. The thing that would decide whether they kept the ranch or lost everything. Evelyn's stomach twisted. They drove to Helena in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Caleb's leg was clearly bothering him. She saw him wince every time the wagon hit a rut. But he didn't complain. Evelyn's own body felt like it had been used for cattle practice, which wasn't far from the truth. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. Morrison met them on the steps, looking harried. "I've got everything we need," he said without preamble. "Payment records, bank statements, the works. Thomas's lawyers are going to try to discredit it, but the evidence is solid." "And if it's not enough?" Evelyn asked. "Then we lose and they foreclose. But I don't think it'll come to that." Morrison looked between them, taking in Caleb's bandaged head and Evelyn's bruised arms. "What happened to you two?" "Storm," Caleb said shortly. "Can we get this over with?" The courtroom was packed. Apparently word had spread that this was going to be interesting. Evelyn saw Victoria Hendricks in the front row, dressed in green silk, looking like she was attending a social event. Thomas sat beside his father-in-law, both of them radiating confidence. The judge entered, same one as before, and everyone stood. He took a seat and surveyed the room with the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "All right," he said. "Let's see what we have. Mr. Morrison." Morrison stood and began presenting their case. He laid out the payment records, the receipts, the canceled checks. He showed the letter from the bank acknowledging payment. He demonstrated, methodically and thoroughly, that every single payment had been made on time and in full. Thomas's lawyer objected to everything. The documents were falsified. The dates were wrong. The evidence was inadmissible. The judge overruled him every time, looking increasingly annoyed. Then it was Thomas's lawyer's turn. He stood and began painting a picture of a failing ranch, a desperate man, a woman who'd appeared out of nowhere to manipulate the situation. He suggested the documents had been forged, that the payments had been backdated, that Evelyn and Caleb were running a scheme to defraud the bank. "And how do you explain the bank's own letter?" the judge interrupted. "The one acknowledging receipt of payment?" "Your Honor, my clients believe that letter was obtained through irregular means." "Irregular means like what? Breaking into the bank vault?" "Don't be ridiculous," the judge looked at Morrison. "Do you have anything else?" Morrison stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Mrs. Evelyn Boone to testify." Evelyn's heart jumped into her throat. They hadn't discussed this. Morrison had said she wouldn't need to testify. She looked at him, panicked, but he just nodded toward the witness stand. She stood on legs that felt like water and made her way to the front. The clerk swore her in, and she sat down, acutely aware of every eye in the room on her. Morrison approached. "Mrs. Boone, how long have you been married to Caleb Boone?" "About 6 weeks." "And in that time, have you been involved in the ranch's financial management?" "Yes, I've been handling the books, organizing the records, managing payments." "Can you tell the court, in your own words, whether the mortgage payments have been made on time?" Evelyn took a breath. "Every single one. I've personally verified each payment against the contract. We've never missed a deadline, never been short on the amount. The bank's foreclosure notice is false." Thomas's lawyer stood. "Objection. The witness has only been married 6 weeks. She can't possibly know the full history." "Sustained," the judge said. "Mrs. Boone, please limit your testimony to what you personally know." "I personally know that since I arrived, every payment has been made on time," Evelyn said. "And I personally found the bank's records showing payments going back 2 years, all current, all accounted for." "Where did you find these records?" Thomas's lawyer demanded. In the bank's own files, they're public record for property owners. And you access these files how? I walked into the bank and asked to see them. They're required by law to provide them. The lawyer's face reddened. Your Honor, this woman has no legal training, no authority to— She has every authority, the judge interrupted. She's a property owner. Next question. Thomas's lawyer tried a different approach. Mrs. Boone, isn't it true that you married Mr. Boone under suspicious circumstances? That you arrived in town as a mail-order bride to another man and switched to Mr. Boone when that fell through? Morrison shot to his feet. Objection! Relevance? I'm establishing character, Your Honor. This woman's credibility is central to— The only thing central to this case is whether the mortgage payments were made, the judge said sharply. And unless you can show how Mrs. Boone's marriage circumstances affect her ability to read a ledger, I suggest you move on. But the damage was done. The courtroom was buzzing. Victoria was whispering to the woman next to her. Thomas looked satisfied. Evelyn felt her face burn, but she kept her chin up. Let them talk. Let them judge. She'd told the truth, and the records backed her up. No further questions, Thomas's lawyer said, smirking. Morrison approached for redirect. Mrs. Boone, one final question. Why are you fighting so hard to keep this ranch? The question caught her off guard. She looked at Morrison, then at Caleb sitting in the gallery, then at Thomas and his smug expression. Because it's mine, she said quietly. Not by birth, not by inheritance, but by work, by choice. I could have run when things got hard. I could have let Thomas Hendricks bully us into giving up. But I didn't. Because this land represents something I've never had before. The chance to build something that can't be taken away by someone else's whim. The courtroom was silent. That's all I have, Your Honor, Morrison said. The judge looked at the assembled lawyers, the packed gallery, the stack of evidence on his bench. I'm going to take a short recess. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes for my decision. Outside, Evelyn paced on the courthouse steps while Caleb sat on a bench, his legs stretched out. Morrison smoked a cigarette and said nothing. I shouldn't have said that last part, Evelyn said. About building something. It sounded honest, Morrison said. Judges like honest. You did fine. Did I do enough? We'll know in 30 minutes. Those 30 minutes felt like hours. Evelyn watched people come and go, watched a wagon roll past loaded with supplies, watched clouds drift across the sky. Normal people doing normal things while her entire future hung in the balance. When they went back inside, the courtroom was even more packed. Apparently word had spread that a decision was coming. The judge entered, and everyone stood. He sat, arranged his papers, and looked out at the room. I've reviewed all the evidence, he said, and I've reached a decision. Evelyn's heart was hammering so hard she thought everyone could hear it. The bank's foreclosure notice is fraudulent, the judge said flatly. The evidence clearly shows all payments were made on time and in full. Furthermore, I find the bank's conduct in this matter to be egregiously bad faith. They knowingly filed false documents in an attempt to seize property they had no right to. Thomas's lawyer started to object, but the judge cut him off. I'm not finished. Not only is the foreclosure dismissed, but I'm ordering the bank to pay damages to Mr. and Mrs. Boone in the amount of $5,000 for the cost and distress of defending against this fraudulent action. Additionally, I'm referring this matter to the territorial attorney for possible criminal charges against whoever filed the false foreclosure notice. The courtroom erupted. People were shouting, arguing, half standing from their seats. The judge banged his gavel. Order! I will have order! Evelyn couldn't breathe. They'd won. They'd actually won. She looked at Caleb, who was staring at the judge like he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Then he looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. Really smiled. Not just that half twist of his mouth, but a genuine expression of relief and joy. Morrison was shaking her hand, saying something about brilliant testimony and solid evidence. Thomas was storming out, his father-in-law shouting at their lawyer. Victoria followed, her silk dress swishing, her face tight with anger. They'd won. Outside, Morrison clapped Caleb on the shoulder. That's the best outcome we could have hoped for. The damages will cover your legal fees and then some. And with the criminal referral hanging over them, I doubt the bank will try this again. What about the original mortgage? Caleb asked. We still owe on that. Yes, but you're current, and after this ruling, no judge in the territory will side with the bank if they try any more tricks. You're safe. For now. For now. It was the best they could hope for. On the drive home, Evelyn felt like she could finally breathe. The land was theirs. The fight was over. They'd stood up to one of the most powerful men in the territory and won. You were incredible in there, Caleb said. The way you talked about the ranch, about building something. I meant it. I know. That's what made it incredible. He was quiet for a moment. I never thought about this place that way. As something to build, it was just what I had, what I was trying not to lose. And now? Now I think maybe we can do more than just not lose. Maybe we can actually win. Back at the ranch, the damage from the storm was obvious in daylight. Fences down, a section of the barn roof torn off, debris scattered everywhere. It would take weeks to clean up and repair. But the cattle were safe, the house was intact, and they had $5,000 coming to make the repairs and then some. That evening, Evelyn made a proper dinner for the first time in days. Roast beef, potatoes, bread she'd baked that morning. They ate at the table like civilized people, not exhausted fighters collapsing over cold beans. I was thinking, Caleb said, pushing his plate away, about expanding the herd. With the damages money, we could buy another 100 head, build up before winter. We could, Evelyn agreed, or we could use some of it to hire help. You can't run this place alone anymore. Not with your leg, and not if we're serious about growing. Hiring help costs money. So does killing yourself trying to do everything. Besides, I ran the numbers. 2 good ranch hands would pay for themselves and increase productivity within 6 months. Caleb considered this. You really think we can make this work? Build it into something bigger? I think we can try. And I think trying is better than just surviving. He nodded slowly. All right. We'll hire 2 hands and expand the herd and fix the damn fences so we don't lose everything in the next storm. They worked through the evening, planning, calculating, dreaming bigger than either of them had dared before. The fight with Thomas wasn't over. Men like him didn't forget losses like this. But for tonight, they'd won. And that was enough. Evelyn went to bed that night feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of someone drowning, but the solid, grounded hope of someone who'd fought for something and earned it. Through the wall, she heard Caleb moving around, probably struggling with his injured leg again. This time, she got up and knocked on his door. You need help? A pause, then, yeah, can't get the damn bandage tight enough. She came in and found him sitting on his bed, the bandage half wrapped around his calf. The injury looked bad, deep bruising, swelling that hadn't gone down. He should probably see a doctor, but the nearest one was in Helena, and neither of them wanted to make that trip again anytime soon. Evelyn knelt and rewrapped the bandage, working carefully. Her hands were steadier now than they'd been in the storm, though they still trembled slightly. Caleb watched her work, his expression unreadable. You didn't have to marry me, he said quietly. That first day. You could have taken your chances in Denver or gone back east. I know. Why didn't you? Evelyn tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels. Because Denver would have been the same as Philadelphia. Different city, same struggle, always one bad day away from disaster. But here, she gestured around the sparse room. Here I have a chance to be something other than what the world expects. Here I can build instead of just survive. Is that what we're doing? Building? Aren't we? Caleb reached out and touched her hand, just a brief contact, his scarred fingers against her work-roughened ones. Yeah, I think we are. Evelyn stood, suddenly aware of how close they were, how intimate this moment had become. Get some rest. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. Evelyn? She turned at the door. Thank you, he said, for everything, for fighting, for staying, for being... He didn't finish, but she understood anyway. You're welcome, she said softly, and went back to her own room. Sleep came easier that night, and for once, her dreams were peaceful. The morning after the court victory, Evelyn woke to the smell of coffee and something burning. She hurried downstairs to find Caleb at the stove, attempting to make breakfast with one good leg and limited success. The eggs were charred black on one side, still raw on the other. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Trying to cook. Thought you could use the morning off." He looked at the ruined eggs and sighed. "Turns out, I'm worse at this than I thought." Evelyn took the pan from him and scraped the eggs into the slop bucket. "Sit down before you hurt yourself more. I'll handle breakfast." "I wanted to do something. After everything you can do something by not burning down the kitchen." She cracked fresh eggs into the pan. "Besides, cooking's easy compared to what comes next." "What comes next?" "Rebuilding. Properly this time. Not just fixing what's broken, but making it better." She glanced at him. "That is what you want, right? To actually build something instead of just hanging on?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee. "I spent 2 years just trying to keep my head above water. Got so focused on survival that I forgot what I was surviving for. Then you showed up and started talking about expansion and growth and fighting like we actually had a chance." He looked up at her. "Yeah, I want to build something. I'm just not sure I remember how." "Then we'll figure it out together. That's what partners do." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, making plans between bites. They'd use part of the damages money to hire 2 ranch hands, experienced ones who could handle the heavy work while Caleb's leg healed. The rest would go toward buying breeding stock and repairing the storm damage. It was practical, sensible, the kind of planning Evelyn was good at. What she wasn't prepared for was the knock on the door 3 days later. She answered it to find Dorothy Palmer from the hotel, looking uncomfortable and holding a basket covered with a cloth. "Dorothy, this is a surprise." "I was out this way visiting my sister. Thought I'd stop by, see how you're settling in." Dorothy handed her the basket. "Brought some preserves and bread." "That's kind of you. Come in." They sat in the parlor, the one Evelyn had scrubbed and furnished with new curtains, and Dorothy looked around with obvious approval. "You've done wonders with the place. Looks like a home again." "It's getting there." Evelyn poured tea from the pot she'd learned to keep ready. Frontier hospitality, Caleb had explained, meant always having coffee or tea available for unexpected visitors. "What brings you all the way out here? Really?" Dorothy hesitated, then set down her teacup. "Word around town is you and Caleb beat Thomas Hendricks in court. Beat him hard. We had the truth on our side, and a good lawyer. Still, that takes guts. And it's got people talking. Let them talk. Some of that talk is good, Evelyn. Women especially. They're saying maybe it's possible to stand up to men like Thomas. Maybe things don't have to be the way they've always been." Dorothy leaned forward. "But Thomas isn't taking it well. He's angry, and angry men do stupid things." Evelyn felt a chill. "What kind of stupid things?" "I don't know exactly, but I hear things at the hotel. Men who work for Thomas's father-in-law, drinking too much and talking too loud. Something about teaching you a lesson, making an example." Dorothy's expression was grim. "I'm probably worrying over nothing, but I wanted you to know. To be careful." After Dorothy left, Evelyn found Caleb in the barn, working on repairing the storm damage to the roof despite his injured leg. "Get down from there before you kill yourself," she called up. "I'm fine." "You're favoring that leg so badly you're about to fall off. Get down." He climbed down, grudging. "What's wrong? You look worried." She told him about Dorothy's warning. Caleb's expression darkened. "Thomas won't try anything legal, not after that judge humiliated him. But Dorothy's right. He's not the type to let this go." He looked around the ranch, calculating. "We need those ranch hands sooner rather than later, and we need to be smart about security." "You think he'd actually attack us? Here?" "I think desperate men do desperate things, and Thomas just lost a lot of face. Men like him can't afford that." Caleb limped toward the house. "I'm riding to town tomorrow, going to hire whoever I can find and stock up on ammunition. I'm coming with you. Evelyn, we're partners, remember? That means we face this together." They rode to Salvation Creek the next morning, Evelyn having finally learned enough about horses not to embarrass herself completely. The town felt different now. People stared, but it wasn't with pity anymore. Some looked curious. Others looked afraid. A few women nodded to her as they passed, small gestures of respect. At the general store, Kowalski greeted them warmly. "Heard about your court victory. Whole town's talking about it. I'm sure they are. Evelyn started selecting supplies while Caleb talked to men about ranch work. Victoria Hendricks entered the store while Evelyn was examining fabric. The blonde woman froze when she saw Evelyn, her expression twisting into something ugly. Well, if it isn't the famous Mrs. Boone, Victoria's voice dripped with false sweetness. I hear you humiliated my husband in court. I told the truth in court. If that humiliated him, that's his problem. You have no idea what you've done. Thomas was trying to help you, trying to save you from wasting your life on a failing ranch with a broken-down man. Evelyn set down the fabric and turned to face Victoria fully. Your husband lied to me, abandoned me, and then tried to steal my property. The only thing he saved me from was the mistake of marrying him. And honestly, compared to what I have now, that's the best thing he ever did for me. Victoria's face flushed red. You think you've won? You think this is over? Thomas has connections you can't imagine. Money you'll never see. He'll destroy you and that pathetic ranch, and Caleb too. He can try. Evelyn kept her voice level. But trying and succeeding are different things. Your husband already learned that. You arrogant little ladies. Kowalski stepped between them. Maybe we should all calm down. Victoria gathered her skirts and swept toward the door. You'll regret this. All of it. After she left, Kowalski let out a low whistle. You just made a powerful enemy. I made that enemy the day I didn't disappear quietly. Might as well own it. Caleb had better luck with hiring. 2 men agreed to work the ranch. Brothers named Jack and Samuel Morris, experienced cowboys who'd been working for an outfit that went under. They were rough around the edges but competent, and they didn't ask too many questions about why Caleb needed help suddenly. When can you start? Caleb asked. Tomorrow, if you need us, Jack said. He was the older brother, maybe 30, with a scar across his chin. We're between jobs anyway. Tomorrow works. Be at the ranch by dawn. On the ride home, Evelyn felt the first real stirrings of optimism. They had help coming. They had money to expand. They'd won their legal battle. Maybe, just maybe, they could actually make this work. That feeling lasted until they saw the smoke. It was visible from a mile away, a dark column rising into the clear sky. Caleb kicked his horse into a gallop, Evelyn following as fast as she dared. Her heart was in her throat, her mind racing through possibilities, each worse than the last. The barn was on fire. Not the house, thank whatever fortune still smiled on them, but the barn where they kept equipment, hay, supplies. Flames were already consuming the roof, and the heat was intense even from 50 yards away. Caleb was off his horse before it fully stopped, running toward the well with a bucket. Evelyn followed, her dress catching on the saddle as she dismounted too fast. Together they hauled water, throwing it on the flames, knowing it was hopeless, but unable to stop trying. The barn was half gone when neighbors started arriving, other ranchers who'd seen the smoke. They formed a bucket line, working frantically to save what they could. By the time the fire was finally out, only the stone foundation and a few charred timbers remained. Caleb stood staring at the ruins, his face unreadable. Evelyn's hands were blistered from the bucket handles, her clothes scorched, her hair singed. Around them, neighbors were packing up, offering sympathies and promises to help rebuild. How did it start? One of them asked. Don't know, Caleb said. Wasn't here. But Evelyn knew. She'd seen the way the fire had burned, too hot and too fast to be accidental. Someone had set this deliberately, and she had a pretty good idea who. After everyone left, Evelyn searched the ruins and found what she was looking for, rags soaked in kerosene, hidden under debris. She showed them to Caleb. Thomas? He said flatly. Or someone working for him. Dorothy was right. He's not done with us. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. If he wants a war, he can have one. No. Evelyn grabbed his arm. That's exactly what he wants. For you to do something stupid, something violent that gives him an excuse to have you arrested or worse. We beat him by being smarter, not stronger. He burned down our barn, Evelyn. I know, and we'll make him pay for it, but legally, properly, in a way that sticks. She was already thinking, her mind working through possibilities. We report this to the sheriff, get it documented. Then we go back to Morrison and add arson to the criminal charges the judge already referred. The sheriff's in Thomas's pocket. Maybe, But the territorial marshal isn't, and neither is the judge who already ruled against Thomas once. Evelyn looked at the ruined barn, at the thousands of dollars of damage, and felt her anger crystallize into cold determination. Thomas thinks he can scare us into giving up. Let's show him he's wrong. The next morning, the Morris brothers arrived to find a burned-out barn and two employers who looked like they'd been through hell. To their credit, they didn't ask questions. They just started clearing debris and salvaging what could be saved. "We'll need a new barn," Jack said, surveying the damage. "Probably costs $3,000–4,000 to build proper." "Then we build it proper," Caleb said. "Better than the old one. Bigger." Evelyn drafted a letter to Morrison, detailing the fire and the evidence they'd found. She sent it by express rider, paying extra for speed. Then she rode to the sheriff's office and filed a formal complaint, knowing it probably wouldn't go anywhere but creating a paper trail anyway. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Cooper, who'd clearly been bought and paid for, barely looked at her report. "You got proof Thomas Hendricks did this?" "I have proof someone set the fire deliberately. The kerosene rags make that clear." "Could have been anybody. Drifter, someone with a grudge." "It was 3 days after we beat Thomas in court. You think that's a coincidence?" Sheriff Cooper shrugged. "Think what you want. Without witnesses or proof connecting Thomas to the scene, there's nothing I can do." Evelyn left the office furious, but not surprised. She'd known Cooper wouldn't help. But now it was documented, and when Morrison took this to the territorial marshal, they'd have a record of local law enforcement refusing to act. Over the next 2 weeks, they rebuilt. The Morris brothers proved their worth, working from dawn to dark. They didn't talk much, but they were efficient and skilled. With their help, Caleb could finally rest his injured leg properly, which meant the swelling finally started going down. Evelyn managed the construction, coordinating materials and workers, stretching their money as far as it would go. The new barn rose faster than she'd expected, taking shape in rough timber and fresh nails. It wasn't beautiful, but it was functional, and it was bigger than the old one. "You've got a good eye for this," Jack told her one afternoon. "Organization, I mean. Most ranch wives just handle the house." "I'm not most ranch wives." "No, ma'am." "You sure aren't." The response from Morrison came a week after the fire. He'd filed additional charges with the territorial marshal, who was investigating. He warned it could take months, but the marshal was apparently interested in a case involving a prominent banker trying to intimidate witnesses in a land dispute. "It's something," Caleb said after reading the letter. "Not much, but something. It's enough to make Thomas worry. And worried people make mistakes." They got the proof of that 2 days later when Dutch Keller showed up with an offer. Evelyn was in the garden, another project she'd started, growing vegetables to cut costs, when she saw Keller ride up. She grabbed the rifle from where it now lived permanently by the door and met him on the porch. "Mrs. Boone?" Keller touched his hat. "Mind if we talk?" "Talk from there." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I come in peace. Got a business proposition." "Not interested." "You haven't heard it yet." "Don't need to. We're not doing business with anyone connected to Thomas Hendricks." Keller's smile faded. "Thomas has nothing to do with this. This is about water rights. Same offer as before, $50 a month for access to your creek. And I'll give you the same answer as before. No." "See? That's unfortunate, because without that creek, my cattle don't have reliable water. And desperate cattle do stupid things, might break through your fences, might trample your garden, might cause all sorts of problems." The threat was clear. Evelyn raised the rifle. "Mr. Keller, if your cattle set one hoof on my property, I will shoot them, and then I will bill you for the damage they caused before they died. Now get off my land before I decide you're trespassing too." Keller's face darkened. "You're making a mistake." "Wouldn't be my first, but at least this one's intentional." He rode off angry, and Evelyn stood on the porch until he was out of sight. Her hands were shaking again, but not from fear, from rage. These men thought they could push and threaten and intimidate, and she'd just fold. They thought being a woman made her weak. They were learning different. When Caleb came back from checking the fence lines, she told him about Keller's visit. "He'll be back," Caleb said, "and next time it won't be just talk." "Then we'll be ready." They were ready 3 nights later when Keller's men tried to cut the fence. Evelyn heard them from her bedroom, the sound of wire being clipped, low voices trying to be quiet. She grabbed her rifle and ran downstairs to find Caleb already on the porch, his own rifle loaded. "You get the house," he said. "I'll handle the fence." "Like hell. We go together." They moved through the dark, following the sounds to the north fence line. 3 men were working by moonlight, cutting wire and pulling down posts. Evelyn recognized 2 of them as Keller's ranch hands. Caleb raised his rifle. "That's far enough." The men spun, startled. One reached for his gun. "Don't," Evelyn said, aiming at his chest. "I've had a really bad month, and I would love an excuse to shoot someone. Please give me one." The man's hand slowly moved away from his gun. "Now," Caleb said conversationally, "you boys are going to fix that fence. Every inch. And then you're going to ride back to Keller and tell him the next person who touches our property is getting buried on it. Clear?" "Keller's not going to like this," one of them muttered. "Don't care what Keller likes. I care about my fence being fixed. Start working." They worked under gunpoint, replacing the wire they'd cut, resetting the posts. It took an hour, and by the end, all 3 men were sweating and miserable. When they finished, Caleb inspected their work. "Good enough. Now get out." After they left, Evelyn lowered her rifle with shaking hands. "Think that'll be the end of it?" "No, but maybe it buys us time." He was right. Keller didn't try the fence again. Instead, 3 days later, someone poisoned their creek. They discovered it when the cattle started getting sick. At first, just a few animals looking off, refusing to drink. Then more, and by afternoon, they had a dozen cattle that could barely stand. Jack examined the creek and found a dead deer upstream, its body bloated and rotting. But when he looked closer, he found the deer had been shot, then dragged into the water deliberately. "Someone's trying to contaminate your water source," he said. "Kill the herd or at least make them too sick to sell." Evelyn felt sick herself. "Can we save them?" "Maybe, if we get them to clean water fast and stop them drinking from the creek." They spent the next 2 days hauling water from the well and driving the cattle to a spring on the far side of the property. Most of the animals recovered, but they lost 4, dead from whatever poison had been in that deer carcass. "This is getting out of hand," Samuel said. "They're escalating." He was right. First the barn, then the fence, now poisoning. Each attack was worse than the last, and sooner or later, someone was going to get hurt or killed. "We need to end this," Evelyn said. "How?" Caleb looked exhausted. His leg was bothering him again from all the extra work. "We can't prove it's Thomas. Can't prove it's Keller. All we can do is defend and hope they eventually give up." "No." Evelyn's mind was racing. "We can do more than that. We can go on a fence." She spent that night going through every document they had, every piece of evidence from the court case, every detail about Thomas's business dealings. And slowly, a picture emerged. Thomas's father-in-law's bank was overextended. They'd loaned too much to too many ranchers, betting on land values going up when the railroad came. But the railroad wasn't coming for at least 2 years, and in the meantime, the bank was bleeding money on properties that weren't producing enough to cover the loan payments. Caleb's ranch was just one of many they'd tried to foreclose on. The difference was, Caleb had fought back and won, and that victory had exposed the bank's shaky foundation. "What if we spread the word?" Evelyn said. "Tell other ranchers what the bank tried to do. Show them the court records. Prove that the bank is willing to foreclose fraudulently when they need cash." Caleb looked up from the ledger he'd been studying. "You want to start a bank run?" "I want to make Thomas choose between coming after us and saving his father-in-law's bank, because he can't do both." It was ruthless. It was exactly the kind of thing Thomas had tried to do to them. But Evelyn was done playing defense. Over the next week, she and Caleb visited every rancher within riding distance. They showed them the court records, explained what the bank had tried, warned them that their own mortgages might not be safe. Some people listened. Others thought they were crazy. But enough listened that word started spreading. The bank in Helena started seeing customers pull their deposits. Ranchers started demanding to see their loan paperwork, checking for acceleration clauses and fraudulent terms. The bank's lawyer, the same one who'd represented Thomas in court, suddenly had a lot of nervous clients. Thomas rode out to the ranch personally. Evelyn saw him coming and met him on the porch with her rifle. Caleb stood beside her, armed and ready. Thomas pulled up his horse and glared at them. You need to stop spreading lies about the bank. Haven't told a single lie, Evelyn said. Just shared the court records, public documents. Anyone could access them. You're trying to destroy my father-in-law's business. No, we're trying to protect our neighbors from the same fraud you tried on us. If that damages the bank's reputation, well, maybe the bank should have thought about that before filing false foreclosure notices. Thomas's face was red with fury. You think you've won? You think this is over? I think you have bigger problems than us right now. Like a bank run, and a territorial marshal investigating you for arson, and a judge who already thinks you're a criminal. Evelyn stepped forward. You wanted to make an example of us, Thomas. Congratulations. You did. You showed everyone what happens when you try to cheat people who won't back down. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Because if anything else happens to this ranch, any mysterious fires, any poisoned water, any cut fences, I'm going straight to the territorial marshal with every detail. And then I'm going to every newspaper from here to Denver and telling them exactly how a prominent banker's son-in-law tried to steal land for a railroad deal. She smiled. How do you think that'll play? Especially with all those nervous depositors already pulling their money. Thomas stared at her, breathing hard. For a moment she thought he might try something violent. Then he seemed to deflate. You've ruined everything, he said quietly. No, you ruined it when you decided cheating was easier than competing fairly. All I did was expose that. He turned his horse and rode away without another word. Evelyn watched him go, feeling no triumph, just exhaustion. Think he'll actually stop? Caleb asked. I think he doesn't have a choice anymore. His father-in-law needs him focused on saving the bank, not feuding with us. And the territorial marshal investigation means he can't afford to be connected to any more crimes. Over the following weeks, the attacks stopped. No more fires, no more poisoning, no more cut fences. Keller's cattle stayed on Keller's land. Life at the ranch settled into something that almost resembled normal. The new barn was finished by early fall. It was twice the size of the old one, with better ventilation and room for expansion. They bought the breeding stock they'd planned on, bringing the herd up to 600 head. The Morris brothers proved so valuable that Caleb offered them permanent positions with a share of the profits, and they accepted. The bank in Helena didn't collapse, but it was severely weakened. Thomas's father-in-law was forced to sell controlling interest to a larger bank out of Denver, and Thomas himself quietly left town with Victoria. Word was they'd moved to San Francisco, far from the scandal and the whispers. Morrison wrote to say the territorial marshal had closed the investigation due to lack of evidence, but the case file was flagged, meaning any future complaints against Thomas would be viewed in light of his history. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was something. Fall turned to winter, and Evelyn discovered she'd learned to love the harsh Montana cold, the way snow covered everything clean and white, the silence of the land under frost. She'd learned to ride properly, to help with the cattle, to shoot accurately enough that Caleb trusted her with the rifle. She'd learned that partnership wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about showing up every day and doing the work, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. One evening in December, she and Caleb sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm. The stars were spectacular, thousands of them scattered across the sky so clear it looked like you could reach up and touch them. I was thinking, Caleb said, about next year. We could expand the north pasture, add another 100 head, maybe build a second barn for hay storage. We could, or we could diversify, add some sheep, try some crops. Don't put all our resources in cattle. Sheep? Caleb sounded skeptical. Wool's a good market, and sheep are hardier in bad weather. Just a thought. You're always thinking, but he said it fondly. Never stop planning, do you? Someone has to. Left to you, we'd still be barely surviving instead of actually building something. He was quiet for a moment. Glad you stayed. That first day when you could have gotten back on that stage and left? I'm glad you didn't. Where else was I going to go? Evelyn sipped her coffee. This is home now. For better or worse? Better, I think. Caleb shifted, and she felt his hand find hers under the blankets. Definitely better. They sat like that, hands linked, watching the stars and planning a future that had seemed impossible 6 months ago. Evelyn thought about the woman she'd been when she stepped off that stagecoach, desperate, humiliated, clinging to broken promises. That woman was gone. In her place was someone harder, stronger, more capable than she'd ever imagined being. The frontier didn't give you what you wanted. It gave you what you earned. And Evelyn had earned this. Every acre of land, every head of cattle, every small victory against people who'd underestimated her. "I love you," Caleb said suddenly. "Should probably mention that." Evelyn turned to look at him, surprised. In all their months together, through all the fighting and building and struggling, he'd never said that, never even hinted at it. "Took you long enough to figure it out," she said. "Took me a while to understand what it was, what you are to me." He squeezed her hand. "Not just a partner, not just someone I married for convenience. You're everything, the reason this place works, the reason I work." That's a lot of pressure to put on one person. "You can handle it. You can handle anything." He smiled. "You herded cattle in a lightning storm. Love should be easy compared to that." Evelyn laughed, and it felt good, felt right. "I love you too. Even though you're stubborn and terrible at cooking and you never ask for help when you need it. We make a good pair then, because you're stubborn and terrible at resting and you never back down even when you should. Damn right I don't." They went inside eventually, when the cold got too bitter even for stubbornness. But that night, for the first time since they'd married, Evelyn didn't go to her room. She went to Caleb's, and he was waiting for her. What happened between them wasn't the romance of storybooks. It was awkward and real and human. Two people who'd been alone too long finally allowing themselves to not be alone anymore. But it was theirs, built on months of trust and partnership and choosing each other every day despite having every reason not to. Spring came, and with it, new challenges. A late frost threatened the calves. A supplier shorted them on feed. The windmill broke and needed expensive repairs. But they handled each problem as it came, working together, making decisions together, building something that was more than just a ranch. By summer, they'd expanded to 700 head of cattle and added a small flock of sheep, which Caleb complained about constantly, but secretly took pride in when they produced their first wool harvest. The ranch was profitable for the first time in 3 years. More than profitable, it was thriving. Word spread. Other women started showing up at the ranch, asking Evelyn questions about managing finances, about standing up to difficult men, about building lives that didn't require permission from anyone. She didn't have all the answers, but she shared what she knew. And slowly, quietly, things in the territory started to change. Not quickly, not dramatically, but changed nonetheless. The railroad did eventually come through, 2 years after Thomas had tried to steal the land for it. By then, Caleb and Evelyn owned not just their original property, but 3 adjoining parcels they'd bought from retiring ranchers. They negotiated their own deal with the railroad company, right-of-way access in exchange for a percentage of profits and guaranteed freight rates for shipping cattle. They became wealthy. Not San Francisco mansion wealthy, but comfortable in a way that meant they'd never worry about foreclosure or survival again. Comfortable in a way that meant they could hire more help, invest in better equipment, take risks that might pay off. But the wealth wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that they'd built it themselves, from nothing, through sheer determination and refusal to give up. 5 years after Evelyn stepped off that stagecoach, she stood on the porch of a house that actually felt like home and watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. Behind her, Caleb was teaching their 3-year-old daughter how to whistle, badly, but with enthusiasm. Around them, the ranch hummed with the sounds of work well done. Dorothy Palmer visited sometimes, bringing news from town and staying for dinner. The Morris brothers had families now, living in houses Caleb had built on the north section of the property. Morrison had become not just their lawyer, but a friend, visiting when business brought him through. Thomas Hendricks was a distant memory, occasionally mentioned in passing, but no longer relevant. He'd found his own life somewhere else, and Evelyn hoped he'd learned something from their battle. Probably not. But that wasn't her problem anymore. Victoria had written once, years ago. A brief note saying she'd heard Evelyn had done well, that maybe she'd been wrong about the ranch being hopeless. Evelyn hadn't written back. Some bridges weren't worth rebuilding. The frontier town of Salvation Creek had grown into something more substantial, with actual stores and a real school and enough people that you couldn't track everyone's business anymore. The bank Thomas's father-in-law had nearly ruined was under new management, more honest but warier. They'd learned their lesson about underestimating women who knew how to fight. As the stars came out, Evelyn thought about the woman she'd been, the one who'd believed a stranger's promises and traveled 2,000 miles on hope alone. That woman had been naive, maybe. Foolish, certainly, but also brave enough to risk everything on the chance of something better. And in the end, that bravery had paid off. Not in the way she'd imagined, not with the man she'd expected or the life she'd planned, but with something real, something earned, something that couldn't be taken away by anyone's whim or lie or scheme. "You're thinking too hard again," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her. Their daughter had fallen asleep on his shoulder. "Just remembering. Good memories or bad?" "Both. Mostly good." She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of someone who'd chosen her every day for 5 years and would keep choosing her for all the years to come. Thinking about how none of this was supposed to happen, how I was supposed to marry Thomas and live in that yellow house and be someone's decoration. And instead I became someone who doesn't need saving, someone who saves herself. She looked out at the land they'd built together, the empire they'd carved from nothing through stubbornness and work and refusal to accept defeat. "I think that's better." "Definitely better," Caleb agreed. They stood there as darkness fell, 3 people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and built something beautiful anyway. The frontier was still harsh, life was still hard. But they'd learned that hard didn't mean impossible, and harsh didn't mean hopeless. It just meant you had to be tougher than whatever tried to break you. And Evelyn Boone was the toughest woman in Montana Territory. She'd earned that reputation one battle at a time, one decision at a time, one day at a time. The mail-order bride who'd been abandoned became the rancher who built an empire. The desperate woman with $11 became the businesswoman who negotiated with railroad executives. The girl who'd been told she was worthless became the woman who proved them all wrong. Not because someone rescued her, but because she learned to rescue herself. That was the real story. Not romance or revenge or any fairy tale ending, just the simple, difficult, glorious truth that you could lose everything and still build something better. That betrayal could become transformation, that the harshest land could forge the strongest people, and in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.